The knock came at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, three sharp raps that shattered the silence of Ethan Cole's half-unpacked living room. He froze mid-step, a box of his daughter's toys balanced in his arms. Nobody knew he lived here yet. The real estate agent had the keys. His ex-wife certainly wouldn't show up unannounced. His heart kicked against his ribs as he set the box down and moved toward the door, every instinct from his old life screaming that nothing good came from unexpected visitors after dark. Through the peephole, he saw her, a woman in scrubs, dark hair pulled back, exhaustion written across her face like a language he'd learned to read fluently in mirrors. She looked as surprised to be standing there as he was to find her on his porch. When he opened the door, their eyes met, and something shifted in the September air between them. She started to speak, then stopped, realizing her mistake. But that single moment, two strangers recognizing the same bone-deep weariness in each other, would become the first thread in a story neither of them saw coming. Before we continue, I want to invite you to follow this journey all the way to the end. Drop a like on this video and comment with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The house on Prescott Street had good bones, the real estate agent kept saying, as if Ethan Cole gave a damn about bones when what he needed were walls thick enough to muffle his daughter's nightmares and a roof that didn't leak when she cried for her mother at 3 a.m. But the price was right, barely, and the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of Charleston street where ancient oaks formed cathedral ceilings over cracked sidewalks and people minded their own business. That last part mattered more than the agent would ever understand. Ethan had signed the papers on a Friday afternoon in late August, his daughter Maya sleeping against his shoulder in the attorney's office, her small hand clutching the collar of his shirt even in sleep. She was 5 years old and had already learned that the world wasn't safe, that people left, that even mothers could disappear into their own pain and not come back. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier. The custody battle had ended 2 weeks after that, when Jennifer signed away her parental rights with the same detached efficiency she'd once used to organize their kitchen cabinets. "I can't do this," she'd said, not looking at him, not looking at Maya coloring at the table between them. "I'm not built for it. I thought I was, but I'm not." Ethan had wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to demand she explain how a person could look at their own child and choose to walk away. Instead, he'd signed where his attorney pointed and watched Jennifer leave the conference room without looking back. Maya had asked where Mommy was going. He told her Mommy needed to take care of herself for a while. Maya had nodded solemnly, as if she understood, and went back to her coloring book. She hadn't mentioned Jennifer since. The moving truck had arrived on a Saturday morning. Though moving truck was generous, it was actually his friend Marcus's pickup loaded with the furniture Jennifer hadn't wanted and the boxes Ethan had packed himself over 4 sleepless nights. Everything fit in 3 trips. His entire life, condensed to what would fill a 2-bedroom fixer-upper with questionable plumbing and floors that creaked like old boats. "You sure about this, man?" Marcus had asked, surveying the peeling paint and overgrown yard. "This place needs work." "Everything needs work," Ethan had replied, lifting a box marked Maya's room, fragile. "At least this is ours." They'd spent the day hauling boxes and assembling Maya's bed, the one piece of furniture Ethan had bought new. She'd picked it out herself, white with carved flowers on the headboard, the kind of bed a little girl dreams about. He'd assembled it in the room with the best light, the one that faced the street, so she could watch the world from her window and maybe, eventually, trust it again. By nightfall, Marcus had gone home to his own family, and Ethan stood in his half-unpacked kitchen, staring at boxes he was too exhausted to open. Maya had fallen asleep on the couch, still in her shoes, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. He'd carried her to her new bed, pulled the covers up to her shoulders, and sat beside her in the dark, listening to her breathe. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure which of them he was trying to convince. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and routine building. Ethan had taken a leave from his job at Morrison & Associates, the architecture firm where he'd worked for 7 years, to get Maya settled. His boss had been understanding. Roger Morrison had 3 kids of his own and had been through his own divorce a decade earlier. "Take the time you need," Roger had said. "The projects will be here when you get back." So Ethan had spent his days establishing rhythms, creating structure in the chaos. Breakfast at 7:30, cartoons while he unpacked boxes, Lunch at noon. Afternoon quiet time while he sorted through the debris of his old life. Photo albums he couldn't bring himself to throw away. Wedding gifts from people who'd stopped calling after the split. Maya's baby clothes that still smelled faintly of the lavender detergent Jennifer had insisted on. He packed most of it into boxes marked storage and shoved them into the attic, out of sight but not quite out of mind. By the second week, he'd enrolled Maya in kindergarten at Magnolia Elementary, 3 blocks away. She'd clung to his leg that first morning, her small face pale and frightened. The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had kind eyes and gray hair pulled into a soft bun. She'd knelt down to Maya's level and asked what her favorite color was. "Purple," Maya had whispered. "Mine too," Mrs. Patterson had said, smiling. "Would you like to see the purple paints we have? We're making butterflies today." Maya had looked up at Ethan, seeking permission. He'd nodded, his throat tight, and watched her take Mrs. Patterson's hand and walk into the classroom. She'd looked back once, her expression uncertain but brave. He'd waved and held his smile until she turned the corner, then walked to his truck and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, making sure she didn't come running out in tears. She hadn't. When he'd picked her up that afternoon, she'd shown him a purple butterfly with uneven wings and glitter everywhere. "I made it for you, Daddy," she'd said, handing it over like a treasure. He'd taped it to the refrigerator as soon as they got home, the first decoration in their new kitchen. The days developed a pattern after that. Drop Maya at school. Come home and work on the house. Patching walls, fixing the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, replacing the cracked tiles in the entryway. Pick Maya up at 3. Homework and snacks. Dinner, usually something simple, pasta or grilled cheese, the kind of meals he could make without thinking. Bath time. Stories. Bed by 8:30. Then the quiet hours when he'd work on his freelance projects, the small residential designs he took on to supplement his income, or he'd sit on the front porch with a beer and stare at the street, too tired to sleep but too wired to rest. It was during one of those quiet evenings that he first noticed the house across the street. It was newer than his, or at least better maintained, a 2-story craftsman with a neat front yard and flower boxes under the windows. The porch light stayed on most nights, warm and welcoming, but he rarely saw anyone come or go. Once, he'd glimpsed a woman leaving early in the morning dressed in what looked like medical scrubs, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She'd driven away in a silver Honda before he'd gotten a good look at her face. He didn't think much about it. In his experience, neighbors were best kept at arm's length, friendly enough to wave to, distant enough that they didn't ask questions. He had enough to handle without adding other people's expectations to the mix. But the house kept drawing his attention. There was something about it, the tidy garden, the fresh paint, the sense that someone cared about it. It reminded him of the life he'd tried to build with Jennifer, the suburban dream that had turned out to be exactly that, a dream, insubstantial and impossible to hold. 3 weeks into their new life on Prescott Street, Ethan's routine was interrupted by a crisis. Maya had woken up with a fever, her small body burning hot and her eyes glassy. He'd called the pediatrician, given her children's Tylenol, and spent the day pressing cool washcloths to her forehead while she dozed fitfully on the couch. By evening, the fever had broken, but she was clingy and miserable, wanting to be held constantly. He'd made her soup, canned chicken noodle, the only thing she'd agreed to eat, and carried her to bed where he'd sat beside her reading story after story until she finally fell asleep. When he'd returned to the kitchen, he'd found the pot of soup still on the stove, now cold and congealed. He'd scraped it into the trash and stood at the sink, gripping the counter, feeling the weight of single parenthood settle over him like a physical thing. This was his life now. No backup, no partner to tag in when he was exhausted. Just him and Maya against whatever came next. He'd cleaned the kitchen, checked on Maya twice, and finally collapsed on the couch around 9:30, too tired to make it to his own bed. He'd just closed his eyes when the knock came. 3 sharp raps, loud in the quiet house. Ethan's eyes snapped open. His first thought was that something had happened, a neighbor with an emergency, someone warning him about a break-in, the police with news he didn't want to hear. His second thought was that whoever it was, they were going to wake Maya. He crossed the living room in 4 strides and looked through the peephole. The woman on his porch wore blue scrubs and white sneakers. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she held a manila folder in one hand. She looked tired, Not the casual exhaustion of a long day, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been running on empty for so long they'd forgotten what full felt like. She glanced at the house number beside the door, then back at the folder, her expression uncertain. Ethan unlocked the door and opened it halfway, keeping his body between her and the interior of the house out of instinct. "Hi," she said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent softened by years of professional polish. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late. I'm looking for Mr. Howard. He used to live here. I'm Dr. Bennett from across the street, and I have some mail that got delivered to my house by mistake." Ethan blinked, processing. "Mr. Howard doesn't live here anymore. We bought the place about 3 weeks ago." Her face fell slightly, and she looked down at the folder as if it had personally betrayed her. "Oh, I didn't realize he'd moved. I've been working so much lately, I barely notice what's happening on my own street." She let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. "That probably sounds ridiculous." "Not really," Ethan said, and found himself meaning it. "I've been pretty focused on getting my daughter settled. Haven't exactly been social." She looked up at him then, and for a moment their eyes met fully. Hers were brown, dark, and expressive, with shadows underneath that matched his own. There was something in her gaze, a recognition, maybe, or just the acknowledgement of shared exhaustion. Two people who'd forgotten what it felt like to not be tired. "Well," she said, taking a small step back, "I'll figure out where to forward this. Sorry for the intrusion." "No problem," Ethan said. "I'm Ethan, by the way. Ethan Cole." Lila Bennett." She shifted the folder to her left hand and offered her right. Her grip was firm, professional, her hand cool against his. "Doctor?" he asked, gesturing to her scrubs. "Gynecologist," she said. "At Charleston Memorial. Currently on a 12-hour shift rotation that's making me question all my life choices." Ethan smiled despite himself. "Single dad to a 5-year-old. I feel that." Something flickered across her face. Sympathy, understanding, something softer than professional courtesy. "That's a lot," she said quietly. "Yeah." He didn't know what else to say. The door was still half open between them, the September night air cooling the space between their words. Lila glanced back at her house across the street, then at him again. "Well, welcome to Prescott Street. It's quiet here mostly. Good place to reset, I guess." "That's the plan," Ethan said. She nodded, stepping off the porch. "I'll let you get back to your evening. Sorry again for the interruption." "No worries. Have a good night, Dr. Bennett." "Lila," she corrected, offering a small smile. "Only my patients call me Dr. Bennett." "Lila," he repeated. "Good night." He watched her walk back across the street, the folder still in her hand, her posture straight despite obvious exhaustion. She climbed the steps to her own porch, unlocked her door, and disappeared inside. A moment later, the living room lights came on, warm through the curtains. Ethan closed his door and locked it, then stood in his own living room, feeling oddly unsettled. The house was quiet again. Maya slept soundly in her room. Everything was exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago, except something had shifted, something so small he couldn't quite name it. He'd met hundreds of people in his life, had conversations far more substantial than the one that had just occurred. But there was something about the woman across the street, about Lila, that lingered in his mind. Maybe it was the exhaustion in her eyes that matched his own. Maybe it was the way she'd laughed at herself, self-aware and human. Maybe it was just that she'd been kind without being intrusive, offering the exact right amount of understanding without pushing for details he wasn't ready to share. Or maybe, he thought, as he checked on Maya one more time before heading to his own bed, it was simply that he'd been alone for so long that any genuine human connection felt significant. He didn't think about it too much. There was no room in his life for complications, for new relationships, for anything beyond the day-to-day work of rebuilding stability for Maya. Lila Bennett was just a neighbor. The conversation had been nothing more than a polite introduction. He told himself that right up until he fell asleep. The next morning began like all the others. Ethan woke at 6:30 to the sound of his alarm, silenced it quickly, and lay in bed for exactly 2 minutes, giving his body time to accept consciousness. Then he got up, checked on Maya, still sleeping, her fever completely gone, and went to make coffee. The kitchen faced the street, and as he filled the pot with water, he glanced out the window. Across the street, Lila's front door opened. She emerged in fresh scrubs, green today instead of blue, with her hair still damp from a shower. She was juggling a travel mug, a large tote bag, and her keys, her phone pressed between her shoulder and ear as she talked to someone. Even from a distance, she looked rushed. She fumbled with her keys, nearly dropped her coffee, and was halfway down her porch steps when she stumbled, catching herself on the railing. Ethan winced in sympathy. He'd had those mornings. Lila regained her balance, said something sharp into her phone, and made it to her car. She threw her bag into the passenger seat, climbed in, and drove away without looking back. The whole scene had taken maybe 90 seconds. Ethan poured his coffee and thought nothing of it. But the next morning, he saw her again. And the morning after that. It became part of his routine, something he noticed without meaning to. Lila leaving for work between 6:45 and 7, always in scrubs, always moving like she was already 10 minutes late. Sometimes she carried a travel mug. Sometimes she didn't, which meant she was running on fumes. Once, she came out wearing one blue shoe and one black one, didn't notice until she was at her car, and went back inside to change. Ethan found himself not watching exactly, just aware. The way you become aware of a bird that nests in the tree outside your window or the neighbor's dog that barks at the same time every afternoon. Background noise that becomes familiar. He didn't think she noticed him. Their paths rarely crossed at the same time. He was usually getting Maya ready for school when Lila left for her shift, and by the time he came back from drop-off, her house was dark and empty. But on a Thursday morning, 3 days after their initial meeting, their timing aligned. Ethan was loading Maya into his truck. She was singing some song she'd learned at school, something about butterflies and flowers, when Lila emerged from her house. She looked more exhausted than usual, her movements mechanical as she locked her door and turned toward her car. Their eyes met across the street. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lila smiled, a small, genuine expression that softened the tired lines of her face, and lifted her hand in a wave. Ethan waved back, feeling strangely caught out, as if she'd noticed him noticing her. "Who's that, Daddy?" Maya asked, following his gaze. "Our neighbor," Ethan said, buckling her into her booster seat. "Dr. Bennett." "She looks tired," Maya observed with the blunt honesty of 5-year-olds. "She works very hard," Ethan said, "like how Daddy works hard." "You're tired too," Maya said, patting his cheek with one small hand. "Your eyes have bags." Ethan laughed despite himself. "Thanks, sweetheart. Very observant." By the time he'd finished buckling Maya in and closed her door, Lila had driven away. But the smile lingered in his mind as he drove Maya to school, as he spent the morning replacing the rotted boards on his back porch, as he picked Maya up that afternoon and listened to her chatter about finger painting and recess. That evening, he made dinner, spaghetti with jarred sauce, garlic bread from the freezer, and they ate at the small kitchen table while Maya told him about a boy named Connor who'd pushed her on the swings. "Did you have fun?" Ethan asked. "Yeah," Maya said, twirling spaghetti around her fork with intense concentration. "He pushed me really high. I could see over the fence." "That sounds fun. Do you think Mommy would want to hear about it?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the careful calm Ethan had built. He set down his fork and looked at his daughter, who was watching him with those serious eyes that seemed too old for her small face. "I don't know, honey," he said carefully. "Your mommy is taking care of herself right now, remember? But doesn't she want to know about me?" Ethan's chest tightened. How did you explain to a 5-year-old that her mother had chosen to leave, that some people couldn't handle the weight of love and responsibility, that he didn't have answers to questions that kept him awake at night? "I think your mommy loves you very much," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But sometimes adults have to make hard choices, and those choices don't mean they don't care." Maya absorbed this with a solemn nod, then went back to her spaghetti. The moment passed, but Ethan felt its weight long after Maya had gone to bed. He cleaned the kitchen, checked the locks on the doors, and stood at the sink staring out at the dark street. Lila's house was lit up, living room lights on, curtains drawn but glowing warm. He wondered if she was home or if she'd just left the lights on out of habit. He wondered if she ate dinner alone or if someone was waiting for her. He wondered why he was wondering at all. The answer came on Saturday morning, when routine finally broke. Ethan had taken Maya to the hardware store to pick up supplies for fixing the guest bathroom shower. They'd spent an hour wandering the aisles while Maya insisted on examining every paint sample, and he tried to remember what size washers he needed. By the time they got home, it was almost noon, and Maya was hungry and cranky. He was carrying her inside. She'd refused to walk, declaring herself too tired, when he heard a voice call his name. "Ethan?" He turned. Lila was standing on her porch, wearing jeans and a faded college sweatshirt, her hair down around her shoulders for the first time since he'd met her. She looked different without the scrubs. Younger, less guarded, almost uncertain. "Hey," he said, settling Maya on his hip. "Day off?" "Finally," Lila said, walking down her porch steps and crossing the street toward them. "First one in 2 weeks. I fully intend to waste it doing absolutely nothing productive." "Sounds like a good plan." "Who are you?" Maya asked, studying Lila with open curiosity. "I'm Lila," she said, smiling at Maya. "I live across the street. You must be—" "Maya," Ethan supplied. "Maya, this is Dr. Bennett. Remember I told you about our neighbor?" "You're a doctor?" Maya's eyes went wide. "Like for sick people?" "Sort of," Lila said. "I help moms and babies." "Are you going to have a baby?" Ethan felt his face heat. "Maya!" But Lila just laughed, genuinely amused. "No, not right now. I just help other people with theirs." Maya considered this. "Okay, we're going to have lunch. Daddy says I can have grilled cheese." "That sounds delicious," Lila said. Her eyes met Ethan's, warm with amusement. "I won't keep you. Just wanted to say hi." "Actually," Ethan heard himself say before his brain could catch up, "we're making enough for 2 if you want to join us. Nothing fancy, just sandwiches, but—" He trailed off, suddenly aware he was inviting his neighbor over for lunch based on a 5-minute acquaintance and a handful of morning waves. Lila looked surprised, then thoughtful. "I don't want to intrude." "You're not," Ethan said firmly, "unless you have plans." "My plans involved leftover Chinese food and a Netflix binge," Lila admitted. "Your offer sounds significantly better." "Then come over," Ethan said. "Give me 20 minutes to get her settled." "I'll bring drinks," Lila said, already backing toward her house. "Sweet tea, okay?" "Perfect." 20 minutes later, Lila knocked on his door, the front door this time. Not like that first night when everything had been uncertain and strange. Ethan opened it to find her holding a pitcher of sweet tea and looking nervous in a way that made her seem more human, less like the composed doctor he'd glimpsed in Scrubs. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She entered hesitantly, taking in the still unpacked boxes in the corner, the mismatched furniture, the evidence of a life still being assembled. "You're still settling in," she observed. "Yeah, it's a process." Ethan led her to the kitchen, where Maya was already seated at the table with crayons and paper. "Maya, Dr. Bennett brought us tea." "Call me Lila," she said to Maya, setting the pitcher on the counter. "Dr. Bennett makes me sound old." "How old are you?" Maya asked. "Maya," Ethan warned. "It's okay," Lila said, laughing. "I'm 30. How old are you?" 5 3/4, Maya said seriously. "Almost 6. Wow, that's very grown up." Ethan made grilled cheese while they talked, listening to Lila engage with Maya about kindergarten and butterflies and the proper way to color a rainbow. She was good with kids, patient without being condescending, genuinely interested without forcing it. Maya, who'd been shy with strangers since the divorce, opened up almost immediately. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, the 3 of them crowded around the small surface, and it felt normal, comfortable, like something Ethan hadn't realized he'd been missing. "This is really good," Lila said, finishing her sandwich. "I can't remember the last time someone made me lunch." "It's just grilled cheese," Ethan said. "It's better than leftover lo mein eaten standing over the sink at midnight," Lila countered. "Trust me, the bar is low." "Long hours?" Ethan asked. "Brutal hours," she corrected. "But I love it. Most days." She paused, then added quietly, "The days I don't love are the ones where I'm too tired to remember why I started." Ethan understood that feeling more than he cared to admit. After lunch, Maya demanded that Lila see her room, and Ethan found himself following them upstairs, watching as his daughter showed off her butterfly painting and her new bed and her collection of stuffed animals, each one introduced by name and backstory. Lila listened to all of it with patience and genuine interest. "You have a beautiful room," Lila told Maya. "Your daddy did a great job." "He built my bed," Maya said proudly. "From a box." "From a box that came with very confusing instructions," Ethan added. Lila smiled at him over Maya's head, and something warm unfurled in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten what to call it. They went back downstairs, and Lila helped clear the table despite his protests. Maya went to watch cartoons, and suddenly it was just the two of them in the kitchen, washing dishes side by side like they'd done this 100 times before. "Thank you for lunch," Lila said, drying a plate. "I didn't realize how much I needed actual human interaction until I got here." "I know the feeling," Ethan said. "It's been pretty quiet since we moved in, just me and Maya against the world." "That's a lot of pressure," Lila said softly. "Yeah." He didn't elaborate, but he didn't have to. She understood. He could see it in the way she nodded, in the sympathy that crossed her face. They finished the dishes in companionable silence. When Lila finally said she should get going, Ethan walked her to the door. She paused on the threshold, turning back to face him. "This was really nice," she said. "Thank you." "Any time," Ethan said, and meant it. "You know where to find us." Lila smiled, a real smile, unguarded and warm. "Careful, I might take you up on that." "I hope you do." She left, crossing back to her own house, and Ethan closed the door feeling lighter than he had in months. Maya appeared beside him, tugging on his shirt. "I like Lila," she announced. "Yeah," Ethan said, watching through the window as lights came on in Lila's living room. "Me too, sweetheart." And that, he would realize later, was when everything truly began. The following Tuesday, Ethan discovered that Lila Bennett took her coffee black with 2 sugars and drank it while standing at her kitchen window, staring at nothing in particular as dawn broke over Prescott Street. He knew this because he'd started making his own coffee earlier, timing it to those quiet moments before Maya woke, and their kitchens faced each other across the narrow street like mirror images of solitary morning rituals. He didn't wave. Neither did she, but there was an acknowledgement in the parallel routine, a silent understanding that they were both awake when the rest of the world slept, both stealing moments of peace before the day's demands crashed down. On Wednesday, he found a container on his porch, homemade banana bread wrapped in foil with a note in neat handwriting. "Thanks again for lunch. Thought you and Maya might like this. Dr. L." Maya had devoured 2 slices before breakfast and declared Lila the best cook ever, which Ethan suspected had more to do with the chocolate chips he'd spotted in the bread than actual culinary expertise. Still, he'd texted Lila a thank you. She'd written her number on the bottom of the note, and received back a simple smiley face emoji that felt like a small victory against the loneliness he'd been pretending not to feel. By Friday, they'd fallen into something that resembled friendship, though neither of them named it. Lila had knocked on his door around 8 in the evening, still in scrubs, holding a bottle of wine and looking sheepish. "I know it's late," she'd said, "but I just got off a 14-hour shift and I really don't want to drink alone. Is that weird?" "That's probably weird. I can go—" "It's not weird," Ethan had interrupted, stepping aside. "Come in. Maya's already asleep." They'd sat on his back porch, the one with the newly replaced boards, and shared the wine while the September night cooled around them. Lila had talked about her day. A difficult delivery, a patient who'd cried with relief, the attending physician who still treated her like a resident despite 3 years of practice. Ethan had listened, offering the occasional comment, mostly just present in a way he suspected she needed. "I'm talking too much," she'd said eventually, refilling her glass. "Sorry, occupational hazard. When you spend all day being professional and careful, sometimes you just need to not be." "I get it," Ethan had said, "and you're not talking too much." "What about you?" Lila had asked, turning to face him in the dim porch light. "What's your story, besides single dad and new neighbor, I mean?" Ethan had hesitated, weighing how much to share, but the wine had loosened something in his chest, and Lila's eyes were kind, so he'd told her. Not everything, none of the worst parts, the moments that still woke him at 3 in the morning, but enough. The divorce, Jennifer's departure, The custody battle that had ended before it really began. Maya's nightmares and his own inadequacy in the face of his daughter's grief. "That's a lot to carry," Lila had said quietly when he finished. "So is 14-hour shifts and difficult deliveries," Ethan had countered. "Maybe," Lila had agreed, but at least I chose this." Maya didn't choose any of it. "No," Ethan had said, "she didn't." They'd finished the wine as the neighborhood settled into sleep around them, and when Lila finally left, wobbling slightly, insisting she was fine to walk across the street, Ethan had watched from his porch to make sure she got inside safely. She'd turned at her door and waved, and he'd waved back, feeling something shift in the careful distance he'd maintained since the divorce. The next morning, he'd found another note on his porch. "Thanks for the company and for not judging my wine-fueled therapy session. Coffee soon?" L. He'd texted back, "Anytime, you know where to find me." October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the oak trees. Maya started bringing home art projects, construction paper pumpkins and handprint turkeys that Ethan dutifully displayed on the refrigerator. Work picked up as he returned to Morrison and Associates full-time, juggling site visits and client meetings with school pickups and dinner preparation. The rhythm was exhausting but manageable, a carefully choreographed dance of responsibility that left little room for anything else. Except somehow, Lila had become part of that rhythm. It started small, morning waves across the street, quick text exchanges about their days, the occasional shared meal when their schedules aligned. Lila would bring takeout from the Thai place near the hospital, or Ethan would make extra pasta and text her to come over. Maya had adopted Lila as a fixture in their lives with the easy acceptance of childhood, asking about her at dinner and insisting on saving drawings to show her. "Is Lila your girlfriend?" Maya asked one evening while Ethan helped her with homework. "No, sweetheart," Ethan had said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "She's our friend." "But you smile different when you talk to her," Maya had observed, with that unnerving perceptiveness she'd inherited from her mother. "Do I?" "Yeah, like you're happy." Ethan hadn't known how to respond to that, so he'd redirected to multiplication tables and pretended not to notice the truth in his daughter's words. The following Saturday, Lila invited them to the farmer's market downtown. It was her first full weekend off in a month, and she'd shown up at their door at 9 in the morning with coffee for Ethan and hot chocolate for Maya, announcing that they were going on an adventure. "I don't remember agreeing to this," Ethan had said, but he'd been smiling, and Maya was already pulling on her shoes, chattering excitedly. The market was crowded with weekend shoppers and tourists, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread and kettle corn. Lila had navigated through the stalls with obvious familiarity, stopping to examine tomatoes and fresh herbs, chatting easily with the vendors who seemed to know her. She'd bought Maya a small pumpkin from a farm stand, and Maya had carried it like treasure, refusing to let Ethan hold it even when her arms got tired. They'd eaten lunch at a small cafe near the waterfront, sandwiches and sweet tea, while Maya fed torn pieces of bread to the ducks swimming in the harbor. Ethan had watched Lila watching Maya, something soft and wistful in her expression. "You're good with her," Lila had said quietly. "I'm trying," Ethan had replied. "Most days I feel like I'm failing." "You're not," Lila had said firmly. "Trust me, I see a lot of parents in my work. You're doing great." The conviction in her voice had meant more than she probably realized. They'd walked back through the market afterward, Maya between them holding both their hands, swinging her arms and singing a song from school. For a moment, they must have looked like a family, mother, father, child, out for a Saturday adventure. The thought had created an ache in Ethan's chest that he didn't quite know how to name. "Thank you for today," he'd said when they got back to Prescott Street, helping Maya carry her pumpkin inside. "Thank you for coming," Lila had replied. "I don't usually do the market alone anymore. It's more fun with company." "Anymore?" Ethan had caught the implication. Lila had glanced away, something guarded crossing her face. "I used to go with my ex. After we broke up, it felt weird going alone. Today was the first time it felt normal again." "I'm glad," Ethan had said, and meant it. That evening, after Maya had gone to bed, Ethan stood at his kitchen window and looked across at Lila's house. The lights were on in her living room, and he could see her shadow moving behind the curtains. He thought about texting her, maybe inviting her over for that glass of wine that had become their unofficial signal for needing company. But something held him back. The awareness that they were building something fragile, something that could shatter if pushed too hard or too fast. So he'd gone to bed instead and tried not to think about how much he'd enjoyed the farmer's market, or how right it had felt to walk beside Lila with Maya between them, or how often lately his thoughts drifted across the street to the woman who'd knocked on his door by mistake and somehow become essential. The equilibrium lasted another week. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Ethan had just picked Maya up from school when his phone rang. Roger Morrison calling about a potential client meeting that needed to be rescheduled. He'd pulled over to take the call, trying to hear over Maya's chatter in the back seat, when he saw the black Mercedes pull up in front of Lila's house. The man who emerged was tall and polished, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage payment. He was handsome in that carefully maintained way. Expensive haircut, perfect posture, the kind of confidence that came from never having to question his place in the world. He'd walked up to Lila's door with a bouquet of flowers and let himself in with his own key. Ethan had finished his call with Roger without really hearing it, his attention fixed on Lila's house. 10 minutes later, the man had emerged, still carrying the flowers, and driven away in the Mercedes. It was none of his business. Lila's personal life was her own, and they were just neighbors, just friends. Whatever she had going on with the man in the expensive suit didn't concern him, except it did, and Ethan hated himself for caring. That evening, Lila had texted, "Wine tonight? Rough day." He'd stared at the message for a full minute before responding. "Can't. Maya has a project due tomorrow." "Rain check?" It was a lie. Maya's project wasn't due for another week, but Ethan needed space to get his head straight, to remind himself that he had no claim on Lila Bennett, no right to feel this twist of something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. Lila had texted back a thumbs-up emoji, and Ethan had spent the evening helping Maya with homework she'd already finished, trying not to glance out the window at the house across the street. He'd avoided her for 3 days after that, leaving for work earlier and coming home later, timing his movements to minimize the chance of running into her. It was cowardly and stupid, and he knew it, but he didn't trust himself to see her and not ask about the man in the Mercedes. Didn't want to hear that she was seeing someone, that whatever friendship they'd built was all she'd wanted. On Sunday morning, Lila caught him. He'd been unloading groceries from his truck when she'd crossed the street, wearing jeans and an old college sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She'd looked uncertain in a way he'd never seen before, her usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "Did I do something wrong?" she'd asked without preamble. Ethan had set down the grocery bags, buying time. "What do you mean?" "You've been avoiding me," Lila had said. "I texted you 3 times this week and you haven't responded. You leave before I get up and you're not home when I get back from my shifts, so either I did something to piss you off or you're avoiding me, and I'd really like to know which." "You didn't do anything wrong," Ethan had said carefully. "Then what's going on?" Lila had crossed her arms, her expression somewhere between hurt and frustrated. "I thought we were friends." "We are. Friends don't ghost each other for 3 days without explanation." She was right, and Ethan knew it. He'd been an ass, letting his own feelings dictate his behavior, punishing her for something she hadn't done wrong. He'd owed her honesty, even if it was uncomfortable. "I saw the guy who came by on Thursday," he'd said quietly. "The one with the flowers and the Mercedes." Lila's expression had shifted. Surprise, then understanding, then something that might have been resignation. "Adrian." "I figured it wasn't my business," Ethan had continued, "but it made me realize that I don't actually know much about your life. And maybe I was reading too much into whatever this is." He'd gestured vaguely between them. "Whatever this is," Lila had repeated, her voice flat. "What do you think this is, Ethan?" "I don't know," he'd admitted, "but I know I miss talking to you this week. I know that when something good happens, you're the person I want to tell. I know that Maya asks about you every day and I have to make excuses for why you're not around. And I know that when I saw that guy at your house, I felt something I have no right to feel because we're just neighbors who became friends, and that should be enough." Lila had stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she'd laughed, a short, sharp sound without much humor. "Adrian is my father's choice," she'd said, "not mine." "I don't understand." Come inside, Lila had said, nodding toward her house. I'll tell you the whole thing. You deserve that. Ethan had followed her across the street, leaving the groceries in his truck, suddenly aware that whatever she was about to tell him would shift something fundamental between them. They'd entered her house the first time he'd been inside, and he'd had a quick impression of clean lines and modern furniture, everything neat and impersonal, like a hotel room rather than a home. Lila had made coffee without asking if he wanted any, her movements mechanical. When she'd finally sat down across from him at her kitchen table, she'd looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. My father is Dr. Richard Bennett, she'd begun, chief of surgery at Charleston Memorial. He's brilliant and demanding, and he's been planning my life since I was 16 and decided I wanted to be a doctor. Ethan had nodded, listening. Adrian Wolfe is a cardiologist, Lila had continued. His father runs the largest private practice in South Carolina. Our fathers are friends, colleagues, probably golf buddies for all I know. They decided years ago that Adrian and I would be perfect together. Same profession, same social standing, same everything. But you're not together, Ethan had said. No, Lila had agreed. We dated briefly in medical school. It didn't work. We wanted different things, had different priorities. We broke up 7 years ago and I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. My father doesn't accept no easily, Lila had said, her voice tight. He thinks I'm being stubborn, that I'll come around eventually. He invites Adrian to family dinners, arranges chance meetings at hospital events, makes it very clear what he expects. And Adrian, she'd paused, choosing her words carefully. Adrian is a good person. He's kind and successful, and he'd probably make someone a great partner. But he's not what I want. What do you want? Ethan had asked quietly. Lila had met his eyes then, and he'd seen the answer before she spoke. Something real? Something that's mine, not my father's plan. Someone who sees me as more than Dr. Bennett's daughter, or a good strategic match. The air between them had felt charged, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to voice. Adrian came by on Thursday to drop off the flowers my father sent, Lila had continued. He has a key because he used to water my plants when I was on rotation. I should probably get it back, but it seemed petty. He stayed for maybe 10 minutes, told me my father wants us to attend some gala together next month, and left when I said no. That's it. That's the whole story. I'm sorry, Ethan had said. I shouldn't have assumed. You didn't assume anything wrong, Lila had interrupted. And I should have told you about this before. She'd trailed off, then started again. I liked that you didn't know. That when you looked at me, you weren't seeing Dr. Bennett's daughter or someone who should be dating Adrian Wolfe. You just saw Lila. It felt like freedom. Ethan had understood that better than she knew. He'd been so many things in his life. Jennifer's husband, Maya's father, the guy whose wife left, and all of those identities had come with expectations and judgments. With Lila, he'd just been Ethan. No history, no baggage, just the person he was trying to become. For what it's worth, he'd said, I still just see Lila. The rest is noise. She'd smiled then, genuine and relieved, and something else that made his heart kick against his ribs. Thank you. They'd finished their coffee in more comfortable silence, and when Ethan had finally gone back to retrieve his groceries, melted ice cream and all, he'd felt the weight that had settled over the past 3 days finally lift. That evening, Maya had been thrilled to see Lila join them for dinner. They'd made tacos together, all three of them crowded in the small kitchen, and afterward Maya had convinced Lila to play Go Fish while Ethan cleaned up. He'd watched them from the sink, Lila laughing at Maya's terrible poker face, Maya chattering about school and friends and the Halloween costume she wanted, and felt something dangerous and wonderful take root in his chest. When Maya had finally gone to bed, Lila had lingered, helping Ethan finish the dishes. My father wants me to bring Adrian to the hospital's annual benefit, she'd said, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary force. It's in 3 weeks. Black tie, major donors, all the people who matter. He's been pushing for months. Are you going to take him? Ethan had asked, keeping his voice neutral. I haven't decided, Lila had admitted. Part of me wants to refuse on principle, but part of me is just tired of fighting about it. What would happen if you went alone? My father would spend the entire evening introducing me to eligible colleagues, Lila had said with air quotes. It would be awkward and awful, and I'd end up hiding in the bathroom. What if you didn't go alone? Ethan had found himself saying before he could think better of it. What if you brought someone else? Lila had turned to look at him, her expression cautious. Like who? Like me, Ethan had said, his heart hammering. If you wanted, no pressure, but if you need a date to shut down your father's matchmaking, I'm available. Ethan, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, he'd interrupted, but I want to, if you want me there. Lila had stared at him for a long moment, and Ethan had watched thoughts flicker across her face. Surprise. Consideration. Something that might have been hope. Finally, she'd smiled. Okay, she'd said. Yeah, that would be... Yeah, thank you. You'll have to teach me how to tie a bow tie, Ethan had said, trying to lighten the moment. I'm pretty sure the last time I wore one was at my wedding. Something had flickered in Lila's eyes at the mention of his wedding, but she'd just nodded. I'll add it to the list of things we need to figure out. She'd left shortly after, and Ethan had stood at his kitchen window watching her cross the street, wondering what exactly he'd just committed to and why the prospect of attending a hospital benefit with Lila Bennett made him feel more alive than he had in years. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and growing anticipation. Lila had explained that the benefit was a major event, the hospital's biggest fundraiser of the year, attended by Charleston's medical elite and wealthy donors. Her father would be there, along with Adrian and his family, and half the doctors Lila worked with. It was essentially walking into a room full of people who had opinions about who she should be with and announcing that she'd chosen differently. Are you sure you want to do this? Lila had asked him one evening while they sat on his back porch. It's going to be intense. My father isn't subtle and people will talk. I can handle it, Ethan had assured her. I've survived divorce lawyers and custody negotiations. I think I can manage a hospital benefit. You haven't met my father, Lila had said darkly. Ethan had rented a tux from a place downtown, and during the measuring process and the salesman's overly enthusiastic commentary about fit and style, Maya had been fascinated by the whole thing, making him model the tux 3 times and declaring him fancy like a prince. Are you marrying Lila? Maya had asked while he'd been adjusting the bow tie in the mirror. No, sweetheart, Ethan had said. I'm just going to a party with her. But you like her, Maya had pressed, like more than friends. Ethan had knelt down to his daughter's level, taking her small hands in his. I do like her, but that doesn't mean we're getting married. It just means we enjoy spending time together. But what if you did marry her? Maya had asked. Would she be my mom? The question had lodged in Ethan's chest like a physical thing. You already have a mom, Maya. Nobody could replace her. But she left, Maya had said with the brutal honesty of childhood. Lila doesn't leave. Ethan hadn't known what to say to that, so he just held his daughter until she'd squirmed away, apparently satisfied with his non-answer. The night of the benefit arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October. Ethan had arranged for Marcus's wife to watch Maya, enduring his friend's knowing smirk and too many questions about his date with the doctor across the street. He'd picked Lila up at 7, and when she'd opened her door, he'd actually stopped breathing for a moment. She wore a deep green dress that somehow made her eyes look darker, her hair swept up in a style that was both elegant and effortless. She looked beautiful and terrified in equal measure. You clean up nice, she'd said, giving him a once-over. So do you, Ethan had managed. You ready for this? Absolutely not, Lila had admitted, but let's go anyway. The drive to the hotel where the benefit was being held had been quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Ethan had reached over and taken her hand, squeezing gently. Whatever happens in there, he'd said, we face it together. Okay? Lila had squeezed back. Okay. The ballroom was exactly as intimidating as Ethan had imagined. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, women in designer gowns and men in expensive tuxedos. A string quartet played in one corner while waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. It was a different world from the one Ethan inhabited, and he felt acutely aware of his rented tux and practical haircut. But Lila kept his hand in hers as they entered, and that made all the difference. They'd barely made it 10 feet into the room when a voice called out, Lila? The man who approached was in his early 60s, tall and distinguished with silver hair, and the kind of presence that commanded attention. He wore his authority like a second skin, and when his eyes landed on Ethan, they went cold. "Dad," Lila said, her voice carefully neutral, "this is Ethan Cole. Ethan, my father, Dr. Richard Bennett." "Mr. Cole," Dr. Bennett said, not offering his hand. "I wasn't aware Lila was bringing anyone this evening." "Last-minute decision," Lila said smoothly. "Ethan is my neighbor and my date." The emphasis on the last word wasn't lost on anyone. Dr. Bennett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see," he said. "Well, I hope you enjoy the evening. Lila, I'll need to introduce you to the Hendersons later. They're major donors, and they've been asking about you." "Of course," Lila said. Dr. Bennett walked away without another word, and Ethan felt Lila's hand tremble slightly in his. "That went well," she muttered. "It's not over yet," Ethan said. "Come on, let's get a drink." They'd made it to the bar when Adrian appeared. Tall, polished, looking at Lila with something that might have been regret or longing, or both. "Lila," he said, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, Adrian," Lila said. "This is Ethan. Ethan, Dr. Adrian Wolfe." The two men shook hands, sizing each other up in that way men do. Adrian's grip was firm but not aggressive, his smile professional. "Enjoying the benefit?" Adrian asked. "Just got here," Ethan said, "but it's impressive." "It's a good cause," Adrian agreed. He turned to Lila. "Can I talk to you for a minute? Privately?" Lila had glanced at Ethan, who'd nodded. "I'll be right here," he'd said. He'd watched them walk to a quiet corner of the ballroom, watched Adrian lean in close to say something that made Lila's expression tighten. When she'd returned 5 minutes later, she'd looked shaken. "What did he say?" Ethan had asked. "That my father is furious I brought you instead of him," Lila had said. "That I'm making a mistake choosing pride over practicality. That you're a nice guy, but I need to think about my future." "What did you tell him?" "That my future is none of his business," Lila had said firmly, "and that I'm exactly where I want to be." Ethan had pulled her onto the dance floor then, ignoring the stares and whispers from the crowd around them. They'd swayed to the string quartet's rendition of something classical and romantic, and for a few minutes the rest of the room had faded away. "Thank you," Lila had whispered against his shoulder, "for being here." "Nowhere else I'd rather be," Ethan had said, and meant it completely. The rest of the evening had been a careful navigation of social landmines, polite conversations with Lila's colleagues, stilted small talk with donors, pointed questions from people who wanted to know exactly who Ethan was and what he did. Through it all, Lila had stayed close, her hand in his, presenting a united front against the judgment and curiosity. When they'd finally escaped to his truck hours later, both of them had collapsed into their seats with matching sighs of relief. "That was exhausting," Lila had said. "That was a nightmare," Ethan had corrected. "Your father hates me." "He doesn't hate you," Lila had said. "He just hates that you're not part of his plan." "Is that better?" "Marginally." Lila had reached over and taken his hand. "But I don't care what he thinks. Tonight was perfect because you were there." Ethan had driven her home through the quiet Charleston streets, and when he'd walked her to her door, she'd turned to face him on the porch. "Come in?" she'd asked. "I don't want tonight to end yet." So he'd followed her inside, and they'd sat on her couch drinking wine and talking until 3 in the morning, until the adrenaline from the benefit had worn off, and all that remained was the two of them, tired and honest and closer than they'd ever been. "I'm falling for you," Lila had said at some point, the words quiet but clear in the darkness. "I know that's probably too soon and too complicated, but I need you to know." Ethan had set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully. "It's not too soon, and I'm already there." She'd kissed him then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper, as uncertainty gave way to certainty. When they'd finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Lila had rested her forehead against his. "This is going to be complicated," she'd whispered. "I know," Ethan had said. "My father is going to make things difficult." "I know. And I have crazy hours, and you have Maya, and neither of us has time for this." "I know," Ethan had said again, "but I want to try anyway, if you do." Lila had smiled against his lips. "Yeah, I want to try." Ethan had driven home that night with the taste of Lila still on his lips, and the certainty that his life had just shifted in a direction he couldn't predict or control. The streets of Charleston were empty at that hour, streetlights casting yellow pools on the pavement, and he'd taken the long way back to Prescott Street, needing the extra time to process what had just happened. He'd fallen for her, completely, irreversibly, in a way that felt nothing like what he'd had with Jennifer. This was different, deeper, more honest, built on a foundation of shared exhaustion and mutual understanding rather than youthful optimism and carefully constructed plans. With Jennifer, he'd been trying to become the man he thought he should be. With Lila, he was just himself, and somehow that was enough. Marcus's wife, Sarah, had been asleep on his couch when he'd gotten home, and he'd paid her double what they'd agreed on, apologizing for the late hour. She'd waved him off with a knowing smile that made him suspect Marcus had already filled her in on the evening's significance. Maya had been sound asleep in her bed, one arm flung over her stuffed rabbit, her face peaceful in the dim glow of her nightlight. Ethan had stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, thinking about what she'd asked him before the benefit. Would Lila be her mom? The question had seemed impossibly complicated at the time, but now, in the quiet aftermath of the evening, it felt less like a fear and more like a hope he wasn't quite ready to examine. He'd gone to bed around 4 in the morning and woken up 3 hours later to Maya jumping on his mattress, demanding pancakes and asking if Lila could come over for breakfast. "It's 7 in the morning, sweetheart," Ethan had groaned, pulling a pillow over his face. "Lila's probably still sleeping, but you like her now," Maya had said, as if this explained everything. "So she should come for pancakes." Ethan had given up on sleep and made pancakes while Maya set the table for 3, just in case. He hadn't texted Lila, figuring she needed rest after her own late night, but at 8:30 his phone had buzzed with a message. "Coffee? I can't stop thinking about last night." He'd smiled at his phone like a teenager, and Maya had noticed immediately. "Is that Lila?" she'd asked, her eyes lighting up. "Yeah," Ethan had admitted. "Tell her to come over. We made extra pancakes." So Lila had arrived 20 minutes later in sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, her hair still damp from a shower, looking nothing like the elegant woman from the benefit, and everything like someone Ethan wanted to wake up next to every morning for the rest of his life. The thought had struck him with startling clarity as she'd walked through his door, and he'd had to physically stop himself from saying it out loud. They'd eaten pancakes while Maya chattered about a dream she'd had involving talking butterflies and a castle made of ice cream. Lila had listened with complete attention, asking questions and laughing at the right moments. And Ethan had watched the two of them together and felt something settle in his chest, a rightness he hadn't known he'd been searching for. After breakfast, Maya had demanded they all go to the park, and they'd spent the morning pushing her on swings and helping her navigate the climbing structure while other families did the same around them. More than once, Ethan had caught other parents glancing their way with knowing smiles, clearly assuming they were a family unit. He hadn't corrected them. Neither had Lila. It was on the walk home, with Maya running ahead to examine every interesting leaf and rock, that Lila had reached for his hand. "My father called this morning," she'd said quietly. 3 times. "Did you answer?" "The 3rd time, yeah." Lila had kicked at a loose stone on the sidewalk. "He wants to have lunch tomorrow. Just the 2 of us. He says we need to talk about my choices." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd meet him, but my choices aren't up for negotiation." Lila had squeezed his hand. "He's not going to make this easy, Ethan. He's going to push and criticize and try to make me doubt this. Doubt us." "Can he?" Ethan had asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fear curling in his gut. Lila had stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Maya was 20 feet ahead, crouched down examining an anthill with intense concentration. "No," Lila had said firmly. "He can't. I've spent my entire adult life trying to live up to his expectations, trying to be the daughter he wanted. I'm done with that. I want this. I want you." Ethan had kissed her right there on the sidewalk, not caring who saw, pouring everything he couldn't yet say into the pressure of his lips against hers. When they'd pulled apart, Maya had been standing 3 feet away, watching them with a huge grin. "I knew it," she'd announced triumphantly. "You do like each other." "Yeah, sweetheart," Ethan had said, pulling Maya into a hug that included Lila. "We do." The next day, Lila had met her father for lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown. She'd told Ethan about it that evening while they sat on his back porch, her voice tight with residual anger and hurt. He started with the reasonable approach, she'd explained, accepting the glass of wine Ethan handed her. Talking about my career, my future at the hospital, how important it is to make strategic decisions. Then he moved on to you. I'm guessing he wasn't complimentary, Ethan had said. He wanted to know what you do for a living, where you went to school, what your prospects are. When I told him you're an architect, he asked which firm. When I said Morrison and Associates, he looked it up on his phone right there at the table and made a face like I'd told him you worked at McDonald's. Morrison and Associates is a good firm, Ethan had said, trying to keep the defensiveness out of his voice. I know that, but it's not prestigious enough for him. Nothing is, unless it comes with the right last name and the right connections. Lila had taken a long drink of her wine. Then he brought up Maya. Ethan's hands had tightened on his own glass. What about her? He said I need to think carefully about getting involved with a single father, that it's a lot of responsibility, that I'm young and shouldn't be taking on someone else's child, that it will complicate my career. Lila's voice had gone cold. Like Maya is some kind of liability instead of an amazing little girl. What did you say? I told him that Maya is part of the package, and I wouldn't have it any other way. That she's smart and kind, and I'm lucky to know her. That if he can't see that, then he doesn't know me at all. Lila had set down her wine glass with enough force that it had clinked against the table. Then he played his final card. Ethan had waited, his stomach nodding. He said that if I continue this relationship with you, it will reflect poorly on him at the hospital. That people are already talking about me bringing you to the benefit instead of Adrian. That the Wolves are influential and I'm burning bridges I might need later. And then he said, she'd stopped, her jaw working. What? Ethan had prompted gently. He said that if I insist on throwing away my future on some divorced architect with baggage, I shouldn't expect him to support me when it falls apart. Lila's eyes had been bright with unshed tears. He actually used the word when, not if. Ethan had pulled her close, letting her rest her head on his shoulder. I'm sorry, he'd said. I never wanted to cause problems between you and your father. You didn't cause them, Lila had said fiercely. He did, with his expectations and his plans and his complete inability to see me as an adult capable of making my own decisions. This has been building for years. You just forced it into the open. They'd sat in silence for a while, the evening air cooling around them. Finally, Lila had spoken again, her voice steadier. I told him that I love what I do, and I'm good at it, and my career will be fine regardless of who I'm dating. I told him that you're a good man and Maya is a wonderful child, and if he can't accept that, then we don't have much to talk about. How did he take it? He paid the check and left, Lila had said. Didn't say another word. Just walked out of the restaurant like I'd personally insulted him. Lila, if this is too much, Ethan had started, but she'd cut him off. Don't, she'd said, turning to look at him directly. Don't you dare suggest we end this to make things easier with my father. I'm not giving you up. I'm not giving up what we're building. He'll either come around or he won't, but that's his choice, not mine. The conviction in her voice had been absolute, and Ethan had fallen a little more in love with her right then. The weeks that followed had established a new normal, one that included Lila as a constant presence in their lives. She'd started keeping spare scrubs at Ethan's house for the night she stayed over after late shifts. Maya had begun referring to her as my Lila, with proprietary pride. They'd developed routines, Sunday morning farmers market trips, Wednesday night dinners at the Thai place, lazy Saturday afternoons at the park or the aquarium or wherever Maya's boundless energy directed them. Ethan's own family had been cautiously supportive when he'd finally told them about Lila. His mother had peppered him with questions over the phone. Is she good to Maya? Are you sure you're ready for this? What if it doesn't work out? But ultimately, she'd been happy to hear something other than exhaustion in his voice. His sister had been more direct. About time you found someone who isn't a complete disaster. When do we get to meet her? The real test had come in mid-November, when Ethan had taken Lila and Maya to his mother's house in Somerville for Sunday dinner. His mother had been warm but watchful, his sister openly curious, and Maya had shown off for everyone, determined to prove that she and Lila were a team. Lila had handled it all with grace, helping in the kitchen and answering questions without seeming defensive, and by the end of the evening his mother had pulled him aside. She's lovely, she'd said. And she's good with Maya. But Ethan, are you sure about this? It's only been a few months. I'm sure, Mom, Ethan had said. I know it seems fast, but it feels right. Your father and I got engaged after 3 months, his mother had admitted. Everyone said we were crazy. We had 42 years together before he passed, so I'm not going to tell you you're moving too fast. I'm just going to tell you to be careful. You've been through enough. I will, Ethan had promised. But being careful was becoming harder as his feelings for Lila deepened with each passing day. He'd catch himself watching her help Maya with homework and thinking about forever. He'd wake up with her beside him and feel grateful in a way that went beyond words. He'd see her exhausted after a difficult delivery and want to solve every problem she'd ever faced. The only shadow over their growing relationship was Dr. Bennett's continued silence. Lila hadn't spoken to her father since their lunch, though he'd sent several texts that she'd mostly ignored. The hospital grapevine had apparently been working overtime because she'd started getting knowing looks from colleagues and pointed questions about her personal life during staff meetings. Dr. Morrison asked me today if I was seeing anyone, Lila had told Ethan one evening in late November. They'd been making dinner together, a complicated pasta dish that required more coordination than either of them possessed. When I said yes, he asked if it was serious. When I said yes again, he got this weird look on his face. What kind of look? Ethan had asked, stirring sauce. Like he knew something I didn't. Lila had chopped vegetables with more force than necessary. Then he said I should be prepared for some resistance from the older attendings, that they're traditional and they care about appearances. Translation, they agree with your father. Probably. Lila had set down the knife. Adrian stopped me in the hallway yesterday, too. He said people are taking sides like this is some kind of hospital drama instead of my life. What did you tell him? That I don't care about sides, and anyone who has an opinion about my personal life needs to get a hobby. Lila had smiled slightly. He actually laughed, said I was braver than he'd given me credit for. You are brave, Ethan had said, pulling her close despite the sauce spoon still in his hand. You're the bravest person I know. I don't feel brave, Lila had admitted. I feel terrified most of the time. Terrified I'm ruining my career, terrified my father will never speak to me again, terrified that everyone's right and this is all going to fall apart. But, Ethan had prompted, because he could hear it in her voice. But I'm more terrified of living a life that isn't mine, Lila had finished. Of waking up in 20 years married to someone I don't love, doing everything right according to everyone else's standards, and realizing I never actually lived. Ethan had kissed her then, sauce spoon and all, tasting oregano and tears, and the fierce determination that made her who she was. The pasta had burned while they'd gotten distracted and they'd ended up ordering pizza instead, eating it on the floor of the living room while Maya built elaborate structures with her blocks, and narrated the entire process like she was hosting a construction show. It had been perfect in its imperfection, and Ethan had thought that this chaotic, messy, beautiful life they were building was worth every bit of resistance they faced. The turning point came on a frigid December evening, 3 days before Christmas. Ethan had been at a client meeting that ran late, and he texted Lila asking if she could pick Maya up from after-school care. She'd agreed immediately, and when he'd gotten home an hour later, he'd found them in his kitchen making cookies, flour everywhere, and Christmas music playing from his phone. "Daddy!" Maya had shouted, running to hug him with chocolate-covered hands. "We're making Santa cookies!" "I can see that," Ethan had said, surveying the disaster zone his kitchen had become. "I hope you don't mind," Lila had said, looking slightly sheepish. She wanted to bake, and I figured why not. "I don't mind," Ethan had assured her, and he'd meant it. This was what family looked like. Flour on the counters, and music too loud, and people who showed up when you needed them. They'd finished the cookies together, decorated them with icing and sprinkles, and put Maya to bed with visions of sugar plums or whatever modern kids dreamed about. Then Ethan and Lila had collapsed on the couch with the last of the cookies and a bottle of wine, both too exhausted to move. "I have something to tell you," Lila had said, and Ethan's heart had kicked up because her tone was serious, almost nervous. "Okay," he'd said carefully. "My father called me at work today," Lila had begun. "He wants me to come to Christmas dinner. He said the whole family will be there, aunts, uncles, cousins, He said it wouldn't be the same without me. That's good, right? Ethan had said. He's reaching out. He said I could bring a guest, Lila had continued. He didn't say Adrian, but he didn't say Ethan either. He just said, if you're seeing someone seriously, they're welcome. That sounds like progress. Or a trap, Lila had said darkly. With my father, it's hard to tell. What do you want to do? Ethan had asked. Lila had been quiet for a long moment, staring at the Christmas tree they decorated the week before, a small artificial one covered in Maya's handmade ornaments and cheap tinsel. Finally, she'd turned to him. I want you to come with me, she'd said. I want to walk into my family's house with you beside me and make it clear that this is real, that you're important to me, that I'm not backing down. But I need to know if you're okay with that, because it's going to be uncomfortable and probably awkward, and my father is definitely going to grill you about everything from your college GPA to your 5-year plan. I can handle it, Ethan had said. Can Maya? The question had caught him off guard. What do you mean? If you come to Christmas dinner, you're not just my date, you're bringing your daughter into my family drama. And I need to know if you're comfortable with that, because once we do this, there's no pretending we're just casually dating. This is serious, this is real. Ethan had taken her hand, lacing their fingers together. Maya already knows this is real. She asks me every night when you're coming over. She saves drawings for you. Last week, she told her teacher that she has 2 homes, mine and yours. This isn't new to her, Lila. She's already all in. And you? Lila had asked softly. Are you all in? Completely, Ethan had said without hesitation. If you want us at Christmas dinner, we'll be there. Me, Maya, and matching ugly Christmas sweaters, if that's what it takes. Lila had laughed through tears she was trying not to shed. I love you, she'd said, the words spilling out like she'd been holding them back for weeks. I know it's soon and probably crazy, but I love you, both of you. I love you too, Ethan had said, and kissed her while the Christmas lights twinkled and the cookies got cold and the world outside his living room ceased to exist. They'd told Maya the next morning over breakfast. She'd been thrilled at the prospect of a fancy Christmas party and had immediately started planning her outfit. Ethan had watched her chatter excitedly about dresses and bows while Lila helped her narrow down options, and he'd felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it was almost painful. Maya had been through so much already: the divorce, her mother's abandonment, the uncertainty of their first months on Prescott Street. She deserved stability and safety and people who showed up. Lila had become that person for her, and Ethan was determined to make sure nothing threatened that. But as Christmas approached, his anxiety grew. Meeting Lila's extended family was one thing. Facing her father again with Maya in tow was something else entirely. What if Dr. Bennett said something that hurt Maya? What if the family made it clear they didn't approve? What if Ethan couldn't protect his daughter from the judgment he knew was coming? Lila had sensed his worry and cornered him 2 days before Christmas while Maya was at school. Talk to me, she'd said, sitting beside him on the couch, where he'd been supposedly working but actually staring blankly at his laptop. I'm fine, Ethan had said automatically. You're not, Lila had countered. You've been tense for days. If you've changed your mind about Christmas dinner, just tell me. I'll understand. I haven't changed my mind, Ethan had said. I'm just worried about Maya. She doesn't understand politics or family drama. If your father says something that upsets her, he won't, Lila had interrupted firmly. My father is a lot of things, but he's not cruel to children. He might be cold to you, but he won't hurt Maya. You can't guarantee that. No, Lila had admitted, but I can promise you that if anyone, my father included, makes Maya uncomfortable, we're leaving immediately. Her well-being comes first, always. The fierceness in her voice had eased something in Ethan's chest. This wasn't just words. Lila meant it. She'd chosen them, and she'd protect them, even against her own family. Christmas morning had dawned cold and clear. Maya had woken at 6, demanding to open presents, and they'd spent an hour in pajamas surrounded by wrapping paper while she'd shrieked over every gift. New art supplies from Ethan, a doctor's kit from Lila that had made her eyes go wide with delight, books and puzzles, and a stuffed elephant she'd immediately named Peanut. Lila had given Ethan a leather portfolio for his architectural drawings, the kind he'd wanted for years but had never justified buying himself. He'd given her a necklace with a small pendant. Nothing expensive, but thoughtful, something she could wear under her scrubs without it getting in the way. She'd teared up when she'd opened it, and he'd clasped it around her neck while Maya supervised, declaring it so pretty. They'd had breakfast, pancakes shaped like Christmas trees, which mostly just looked like lumpy circles, and then started getting ready for the afternoon dinner at the Bennett house. Maya had insisted on wearing her purple velvet dress with white tights and her fancy shoes that she'd only worn twice. Lila had helped her with her hair, creating an elaborate braid that made Maya feel like a princess. Ethan had put on the one good suit he owned, the one he wore to client presentations and meetings with people who cared about appearances. In the mirror, he'd looked respectable enough, though he'd known that next to Lila's family, he'd probably seem underdressed and out of place. "You look handsome," Lila had said from the doorway, watching him adjust his tie for the third time. "I look nervous," Ethan had corrected. That too. She'd crossed the room and fixed his tie with practiced efficiency. "But we're doing this together, remember? You, me, and Maya. A team." "A team," Ethan had repeated, and tried to believe it. The Bennett house was in one of Charleston's old money neighborhoods, the kind where houses had names instead of just addresses, and the driveways were longer than some city blocks. Ethan had pulled up to the circular drive and stared at the three-story colonial with its perfect landscaping and tasteful Christmas decorations, feeling like he'd driven into a different tax bracket. "It's big," Maya had observed from the back seat. "It's ridiculous," Lila had muttered. "Come on, let's get this over with." Dr. Richard Bennett had answered the door himself, dressed in expensive casual clothes that probably cost more than Ethan's entire wardrobe. His eyes had swept over Ethan with cool assessment before landing on Maya. "Lila," he'd said, "glad you could make it." "Merry Christmas, Dad," Lila had said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is Ethan, and this is Maya." "Mr. Cole," Dr. Bennett had said, offering his hand. His grip had been firm, professional, and utterly without warmth. Then he'd crouched down to Maya's level, and his expression had softened fractionally. "And you must be Maya. Your dress is very pretty." "Thank you," Maya had said shyly, pressing against Ethan's leg. "Come in," Dr. Bennett had said, straightening. "Everyone's in the living room." They'd entered a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfect furniture, perfect decorations, everything coordinated and expensive, and utterly devoid of the warmth that made a place feel like home. Ethan had thought of his own living room with its mismatched furniture and Maya's toys scattered across the floor, and felt a pang of something that might have been homesickness, despite still being in Charleston. The living room had been full of people, aunts and uncles whose names Ethan had immediately forgotten, cousins in their 20s sipping wine and making polite conversation, and Lila's mother, an elegant woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had assessed Ethan with the same cool precision as her husband's. Lila had made introductions, her hand never leaving Ethan's, and he'd shaken hands and smiled and tried to remember who was who while Maya had stayed glued to his side, overwhelmed by the crowd of strangers. Dinner had been elaborate and formal, served in a dining room with a table that could seat 20. Maya had been placed between Ethan and Lila, and she'd been on her best behavior, using her napkin and saying please and thank you, clearly trying to make a good impression. The conversation had been polite and surface level at first. Questions about Ethan's work that Dr. Bennett had asked with clinical precision, discussions of hospital politics that had gone over Ethan's head, stories about family members he'd never met. But as dinner progressed and wine flowed, the questions had gotten more pointed. "So Ethan," one of Lila's uncles had said, "Lila tells us you have your own firm?" "I work for Morrison and Associates," Ethan had corrected. "I'm a senior architect there." "But you have ambitions to start your own practice?" the uncle had pressed. "Eventually, maybe," Ethan had said carefully. "Right now I'm focused on building experience and taking care of my daughter." "Admirable," the uncle had said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Lila's mother had engaged Maya in conversation about school and favorite subjects, and Maya had blossomed under the attention, chattering about her teacher and her friends, and the butterfly project she'd made. But Ethan had noticed Dr. Bennett watching them, his expression unreadable, and he'd felt the weight of that scrutiny like a physical thing. After dinner, while the adults had moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Maya had tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Daddy, I don't feel good," she'd whispered. Ethan had felt her forehead, warm but not feverish, and realized she was just overwhelmed, exhausted from being on her best behavior for hours. "Do you want to go home?" Maya had nodded, and Ethan had caught Lila's eye across the room. She'd excused herself immediately and joined them in the hallway. "Everything okay?" she'd asked. "Maya's tired," Ethan had explained. "I think we should probably head out." "Of course," Lila had said without hesitation. "Let me just say goodbye to my parents." But Dr. Bennett had appeared before she could move, his expression stern. "Leaving already?" he'd asked. "Maya's had a long day," Ethan had said. "She needs to get home." "Of course," Dr. Bennett had said. Then to Lila, "Can I speak with you privately before you go?" Lila had glanced at Ethan, who'd nodded. She'd followed her father into his study while Ethan had helped Maya into her coat, listening to her yawn and lean heavily against his leg. 5 minutes had stretched to 10, and Ethan had started to worry. Finally, Lila had emerged, her face pale but composed. "Ready?" she'd asked. They'd said their goodbyes and made it to the car before Lila had let her composure crack. She'd sat in the passenger seat, breathing hard, while Ethan had buckled Maya into her booster seat. "What did he say?" Ethan had asked once they were on the road, Maya already dozing in the back. "He said I'm making a mistake," Lila had said flatly. "That you're a phase, that once the novelty wears off, I'll realize I've limited my options. That Maya is sweet, but she's not my responsibility, and I'm too young to be playing stepmother." Ethan's hands had tightened on the steering wheel. "What did you say?" "I told him he was wrong," Lila had said. "That you're not a phase, that I love you, and that if he can't accept that, then we don't have anything more to discuss." "Lila, he said he won't watch me throw my life away," Lila had continued, her voice shaking. "That when this falls apart, I shouldn't come crying to him." They'd driven the rest of the way in silence, and when they'd gotten home, Ethan had carried sleeping Maya to her bed while Lila had stood in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself. "I'm sorry," she'd said when he'd emerged from Maya's room. "I thought he might surprise me. I thought maybe seeing you with Maya, seeing how good you are together, might change his mind." "It's not your fault," Ethan had said, pulling her close. "He's scared. Parents get scared when their kids make choices they don't understand." "But what if he's right?" Lila had whispered against his chest. "What if this is too much, too fast? What if I am making a mistake?" Ethan had pulled back enough to look at her face, tilting her chin up so their eyes met. "Do you feel like you're making a mistake?" "No," Lila had said immediately. "No, being with you feels like the first right decision I've made in years." "Then trust that," Ethan had said. "Trust us. The rest will work itself out." But as he'd held her in the quiet of his living room, the Christmas tree lights casting shadows on the walls, Ethan had wondered if that was true. Dr. Bennett was a powerful man with strong opinions and the influence to make Lila's life difficult. They were fighting against expectations and social pressure and the weight of a future that had been planned for her before she'd ever met Ethan. He'd wanted to believe love was enough, but for the first time since that knock on his door in September, he'd felt genuinely afraid that it might not be. The fear didn't materialize immediately. January came with its typical post-holiday quiet, and life on Prescott Street settled back into routine. Maya returned to school with stories about her Christmas presents. Lila went back to her brutal hospital schedule, and Ethan threw himself into a major residential project that demanded most of his attention. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but underneath, tension simmered like water just before boiling. It started with small things. Lila mentioned that her father had stopped responding to her texts entirely. Then one of the senior physicians at the hospital had pulled her aside to express concern about her recent choices, strongly suggesting that personal relationships shouldn't interfere with professional judgment. An aunt had called under the guise of checking in, but had spent 20 minutes explaining why Dr. Bennett was only looking out for Lila's best interests. "They're circling the wagons," Lila had said one night in mid-January, pacing Ethan's kitchen while he made dinner. "My father's mobilizing everyone who'll listen. He probably thinks if enough people tell me I'm wrong, I'll break." "Will you?" Ethan had asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Lila had stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "No, but it's exhausting. Every day at the hospital feels like walking through a minefield. People who used to be friendly are suddenly distant. Adrian won't even make eye contact with me anymore. And my mother called yesterday to tell me I'm breaking my father's heart." "What did you say?" "That he's breaking mine," Lila had said quietly. But I don't think she heard me. Maya had wandered into the kitchen then, asking about homework help, and the conversation had ended. But Ethan had lain awake that night after Lila went home, staring at the ceiling and wondering how long they could sustain this. How long before the pressure became too much? How long before Lila looked at him and Maya and saw the source of her problems instead of the people she loved? The answer came faster than he'd expected. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late January when Ethan's phone rang during a client meeting. He'd ignored it the first time, but when it rang again immediately, he'd excused himself and stepped into the hallway. "Ethan?" Lila's voice had been shaking. "Can you talk?" "What's wrong?" he'd asked, his heart already racing. "I need to see you, tonight, after Maya goes to bed." "Lila, you're scaring me. What happened?" "I can't. Not over the phone. Just please. I'll come over around 9. She'd hung up before he could respond, and Ethan had spent the rest of the meeting unable to focus, running through worst-case scenarios in his mind. Had something happened at the hospital? Had her father done something? Was she ending things? That last thought had lodged in his chest like a shard of glass. He'd picked Maya up from school on autopilot, made dinner without tasting it, helped with homework while barely processing the words on the page. Maya had asked him 3 times if he was okay, and he'd lied each time, saying he was just tired. At 8:30, he'd tucked Maya into bed and read her 2 stories, holding her a little longer than usual when she'd fallen asleep. Then he'd gone downstairs and waited, watching the clock and trying not to imagine his life without Lila in it. She'd arrived at 9 exactly, her face pale and eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. Ethan had let her in without a word, and they'd sat on the couch in silence for a long moment before she finally spoke. "They're making me choose," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who is?" "My father, the hospital board, everyone." Lila had pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small. "There's a fellowship opportunity at Johns Hopkins, maternal fetal medicine. It's incredibly competitive, and my father pulled strings to get me an interview." Ethan's stomach had dropped. "Baltimore." "Yeah." Lila had wiped at her eyes. "It's an amazing opportunity. 2 years of specialized training, working with some of the best physicians in the country. It would set up my entire career." "But you'd have to leave Charleston," Ethan had said, already knowing where this was going. "My father presented it to me this afternoon, in his office, with 2 other attendings there as witnesses. He said it's time for me to think seriously about my future, that I've been distracted lately, that my personal life is affecting my judgment, and that this fellowship would be good for me. A fresh start. And if you don't take it?" Lila had looked at him then, and the anguish in her eyes had nearly broken him. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. "If I stay in Charleston with you, I'm choosing to limit myself. I'm choosing you over my career, and everyone at the hospital will know it." Ethan had wanted to say something, to argue or reassure or fix this somehow, but his throat had been too tight with the realization that he couldn't compete with Johns Hopkins. He couldn't offer Lila a prestigious fellowship or professional advancement or the approval of her father and colleagues. All he could offer was himself and Maya, and a life that would always come with judgment and whispered conversations. "When do you have to decide?" he'd managed to ask. "The interview is in 2 weeks. If I get it, I'd start in July." 6 months. They'd have 6 months before she left. "You should do it," Ethan had said, and watched Lila's face crumble. "What?" "You should take the interview. Apply for the fellowship. This is your career, Lila. I can't be the reason you give up something like this." "You're not giving me permission," Lila had said, her voice rising. "This isn't your decision to make." "I know that, but I also know that if you don't do this, you'll resent me eventually. Maybe not now, maybe not next year, but someday you'll look back and wonder what you gave up for a relationship that started because I knocked on the wrong door." "That's not fair," Lila had said, standing up. "You don't get to decide how I'll feel in the future." "No, but I can see what's happening right now. Your father is freezing you out. Your colleagues are judging you. Your entire professional life is being compromised because you're with me. And now there's this fellowship that could change everything for you. And you're hesitating because of what? Because you love me? Because Maya needs you?" "Yes," Lila had shouted, then immediately lowered her voice, remembering Maya asleep upstairs. Yes, because I love you. Because Maya does need me, and I need both of you. Because for the first time in my life, I have something that's mine, something I chose, and I'm not ready to give it up. But you might have to, Ethan had said quietly. And if that's the choice, you should choose your career. I'll survive. Maya will understand eventually, but if you give this up for us and things don't work out, you'll have nothing. Lila had stared at him like he'd slapped her. Is that what you think this is? Nothing? That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. Lila had cut him off. You're already pushing me away. You're already convinced this won't last, so you're making the decision for me. Just like my father, just like everyone else who thinks they know what's best for my life. I'm trying to protect you, Ethan had said desperately. I don't need protection, Lila had shot back. I need you to fight for this. For us. But instead you're handing me an out the first time things get difficult. This isn't just difficult, Lila. This is your entire future. And you're part of that future. Lila's voice had broken. Don't you understand that? I don't want Hopkins if it means losing you. I don't want the fellowship or the prestige or my father's approval if the cost is giving up the only thing that's made me happy in years. They'd stood there in the quiet living room, the space between them feeling like miles despite being only a few feet apart. Ethan had wanted to close that distance, to pull her into his arms and promise they'd figure it out together. But he'd also seen the truth in her tear-stained face. This wasn't sustainable. Eventually, the pressure would crack something, and when it did, the fallout would destroy all of them. I think you should go home, Ethan had said finally. Think about this without me influencing you. Make whatever decision is right for you, and I'll support it. Even if that decision is walking away from the fellowship to stay with you? Ethan had hesitated too long before answering, and Lila had seen it. Her expression had shuddered, walls going up that he'd spent months helping her tear down. Right, she'd said, her voice flat. That's what I thought. She'd left without another word, and Ethan had stood at his window watching her house across the street, the lights turning on and then off again an hour later, and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The next 2 weeks had been excruciating. Lila had stopped coming over. She'd responded to Ethan's texts with polite, distant messages that felt like talking to a stranger. Maya had asked about her constantly, and Ethan had run out of excuses for why Lila was so busy. Did she stop liking us? Maya had asked one night, her small voice breaking Ethan's heart. No, sweetheart, Ethan had said, pulling her close. She's just dealing with some grown-up stuff right now. Is it my fault? Absolutely not, Ethan had said fiercely. None of this is your fault. Lila loves you very much. Sometimes adults just have hard choices to make. But Maya hadn't looked convinced, and Ethan had felt the guilt settle deeper. He'd done this. He'd pushed Lila away because he was afraid, because he'd convinced himself that loving her meant letting her go. But all he'd accomplished was hurting everyone involved. On the day of Lila's interview at Hopkins, Ethan had texted her good luck. She'd responded with a simple thanks, and he'd spent the entire day checking his phone, wondering how it was going, wishing he could be there to support her. She'd returned to Charleston that evening, and Ethan had watched from his window as she'd gotten out of her car and walked into her house without looking his way. The lights in her living room had stayed on until after midnight, and he'd wanted so badly to cross the street and knock on her door, to ask how it went and hold her regardless of the answer. But he'd stayed where he was, giving her the space he'd insisted she needed. 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, there'd been a knock on his door. Ethan had opened it to find not Lila, but Dr. Richard Bennett standing on his porch. Mr. Cole, Bennett had said, I hope I'm not interrupting. May I come in? Ethan had wanted to refuse, to slam the door in the face of the man who'd caused so much pain, but Maya was at a friend's house for a playdate, and part of him needed to hear what Bennett had to say. Sure, he'd said, stepping aside. They'd sat in the living room, Bennett looking out of place among the comfortable chaos of Ethan's life. Maya's toys in the corner, throw blankets on the couch, coffee rings on the table. I'll be direct, Bennett had said. Lila got the Hopkins Fellowship. They called yesterday. She starts in July. The words had hit Ethan like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting them. Congratulations to her. She hasn't accepted yet, Bennett had continued. She's being stubborn about it, which is why I'm here. I don't understand. Bennett had leaned forward, his expression hard. You need to convince her to take it. That's not my place, Ethan had said carefully. Yes, it is, Bennett had shot back. You're the reason she's hesitating. She's willing to throw away this opportunity because she thinks she's in love with you. She is in love with me, Ethan had said, forcing himself to meet Bennett's eyes. And I'm in love with her. Love, Bennett had said with dismissive wave. Love is a temporary emotion, Mr. Cole. Careers are permanent. Opportunities like this don't come twice. I've told her the same thing, Ethan had admitted. I've encouraged her to take the fellowship. Then encourage harder, Bennett had said. End the relationship. Make it clear you're not waiting for her. Give her a reason to move on. You want me to break up with her? I want you to set her free, Bennett had corrected. You're an anchor around her potential. She's brilliant, talented, destined for great things, and she's letting all of that slip away because you've made her believe she needs to choose between her career and her personal life. That's not true, isn't it? Bennett had challenged. Be honest with yourself, Mr. Cole. Can you really give her the life she deserves? You're a single father with limited means and no social standing. You live in this house that still has boxes in the corner 5 months after moving in. Your daughter is sweet, but she's not Lila's responsibility, and eventually the novelty of playing house will wear off. What happens then, when Lila realizes she's given up everything for a relationship that was never meant to last? Every word had been a carefully placed knife, finding soft spots Ethan hadn't known existed. Because underneath the cruelty, there was truth. He couldn't give Lila the kind of life her father expected. He couldn't compete with prestigious fellowships or professional advancement. All he had was love, and apparently that wasn't enough. What do you want from me? Ethan had asked quietly. I want you to do the right thing, Bennett had said. End it cleanly. Let her go to Baltimore without looking back. You'll both move on eventually, and she'll thank you for it someday. And if I don't, then I'll make things very difficult for both of you, Bennett had said without hesitation. I have influence at Charleston Memorial and beyond. I can ensure that Lila's career here becomes untenable, that opportunities dry up, that her professional reputation suffers. I don't want to do that. I love my daughter, but I will protect her future, even from herself. He'd stood then, buttoning his coat with precise movements. Think about what I've said, Mr. Cole. Think about what's best for Lila, not what's best for you. If you truly love her, you'll let her go. Bennett had left, and Ethan had sat alone in his living room for over an hour, the man's words echoing in his head. Every insecurity he'd buried since the divorce had come rushing back. Jennifer had left because he wasn't enough. What made him think Lila would be different? What made him think he could be enough for anyone? When Maya had come home that afternoon, chattering about her play date, Ethan had barely heard her. His mind had been spinning with Bennett's ultimatum and his own fears, trying to find a path forward that didn't end in heartbreak. That evening, after Maya went to bed, Ethan had finally crossed the street and knocked on Lila's door. She'd answered in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, her hair down and eyes wary. Can we talk? He'd asked. Lila had let him in, and they'd sat on her couch with careful distance between them. The easy intimacy they'd built over months had evaporated, replaced by awkward formality. Your father came to see me, Ethan had said. Lila's expression had hardened. Of course he did. What did he say? That you got the fellowship. Congratulations. Thank you, Lila had said quietly. I haven't accepted it yet. Why not? Because I don't know if I want it anymore, Lila had admitted. 2 weeks ago, I would have been thrilled. It's everything I thought I wanted. But now all I can think about is what I'd be leaving behind. You'd be leaving behind a relationship that's caused you nothing but problems, Ethan had said, the words feeling like broken glass in his mouth. Lila, your father is right. This is an incredible opportunity. You should take it. We've had this conversation, Lila had said tiredly. I don't need you to tell me what to do. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I think you should do, and I think you should go to Baltimore, do the fellowship, build the career you've always wanted, without me holding you back. You're not holding me back. Yes, I am, Ethan had insisted. Look at what's happened since we got together. Your father won't speak to you. Your colleagues are judging you. You're turning down fellowships because of me. How is that not holding you back? Because I'm making my own choices, Lila had said, her voice rising. Why can't anyone understand that? I'm not a child who needs to be protected or guided. I'm an adult making adult decisions about my life. Then make the right one, Ethan had said. Choose your career. Choose your future. Choose yourself for once instead of trying to prove something to your father or to me or to anyone else. Lila had stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Is this what you want? You want me to leave? Ethan had wanted to say no. He'd wanted to pull her close and beg her to stay, to choose him and Maya over everything else. But Bennett's words had still been echoing in his mind, along with his own deep-seated fear that he'd never be enough. I want you to be happy, he'd said instead. And I don't think you can be happy here. Not really. Not with all this pressure and judgment. So that's it? Lila had asked. You're giving up on us? I'm setting you free, Ethan had said, echoing Bennett's words without meaning to. If you take the fellowship, I won't wait. I won't expect you to come back. We'll make a clean break, and you can start fresh in Baltimore without any complications. Lila had stood up then, her whole body shaking. Get out! Lila, get out of my house, she'd repeated, her voice breaking. You don't get to make this decision for me. You don't get to decide what makes me happy. But if you want out this badly, if you're this desperate to end things, then fine. Consider it ended. Ethan had left without another word, and when he'd looked back from his own porch, Lila's curtains had been drawn and her lights were going out one by one. He told himself it was for the best, that he'd done the right thing, that Lila would go to Baltimore and build an incredible career and eventually realize he'd set her free to become who she was meant to be. But as he'd lain in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence, all he'd felt was the crushing weight of his own cowardice. The next morning, Maya had found him making coffee in the kitchen and had immediately sensed something was wrong. Where's Lila? She'd asked. Is she coming for breakfast? No, sweetheart, Ethan had said, kneeling down to her level. Lila's not going to be coming over anymore. Why not? Because she got a really important job in another city. She has to move away. Maya's face had crumpled. But she can't leave. She promised she wouldn't leave like Mommy did. I know, baby, Ethan had said, pulling her close as she started to cry. I know it feels like that. But sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices, and Lila has to do what's best for her career. But what about us? Maya had sobbed into his shoulder. Don't we matter? Ethan hadn't had an answer for that. He just held his daughter while she cried for the second woman in her life to walk away, and hated himself for causing this pain. The weeks that followed had been the hardest since the divorce. Maya had been withdrawn and sad, asking about Lila constantly despite Ethan's gentle reminders that she was busy. Ethan himself had moved through his days like a ghost, working and parenting on autopilot while trying not to look at Lila's house across the street. He'd seen her leave for work each morning, the same routine they'd shared for months. But now she didn't look his way, and he didn't wave. They were strangers again, living parallel lives that no longer intersected. Marcus had come over one evening in early February and had taken one look at Ethan before pouring them both whiskey. You look like hell, Marcus had said. Thanks, Ethan had replied. You want to talk about it? Not really. Tough, Marcus had said. Because Sarah sent me over here with explicit instructions not to leave until you've talked about whatever's eating you alive. So Ethan had told him everything. The fellowship, Bennett's visit, the breakup, the crushing guilt every time Maya asked about Lila. Marcus had listened without interrupting, and when Ethan finished, he'd drained his whiskey and poured them both another. You're an idiot, Marcus had said flatly. Excuse me? You heard me. You're an idiot. You had a good thing with Lila and you threw it away because you're scared. I did it for her, Ethan had protested. Bullshit, Marcus had countered. You did it because you're terrified of being abandoned again, so you abandoned her first. You saw an exit and you took it, and now you're trying to convince yourself it was noble. That's not fair. Isn't it? Marcus had challenged. Look me in the eye and tell me that fear didn't play into your decision. Tell me you weren't thinking about Jennifer leaving, about not being enough, about protecting yourself from getting hurt again. Ethan had opened his mouth to argue and found he couldn't. Because Marcus was right. Underneath all the rationalization about Lila's career and doing the right thing, he'd been protecting himself. He'd pushed her away before she could leave him, and he'd hurt everyone in the process. So what do I do now? Ethan had asked quietly. You fight for her, Marcus had said simply. You go over there and you tell her the truth, that you're scared and you screwed up, but you love her and you want to try. And if she still chooses the fellowship, at least she'll be choosing it for the right reasons. What if it's too late? Then you'll know, Marcus had said, but at least you'll have tried. Ethan had sat with that advice for 2 more days, building up the courage to cross the street and face Lila. But before he could make his move, she'd beaten him to it. He'd come home from work on a Wednesday evening to find her sitting on his porch steps, still in her scrubs, her eyes red, but her expression determined. "We need to talk," she'd said. Ethan's heart had started pounding the moment he'd seen her on his porch. Maya was still at after-school care, giving them privacy he wasn't sure he wanted. The last real conversation they'd had ended with Lila throwing him out of her house, and he'd spent every day since replaying that moment, wondering if he could have said something different, done something better. "Okay," he'd said, unlocking the door and letting them both inside. They'd stood awkwardly in the living room, neither sitting, the space between them feeling vast despite being only a few feet. "I turned down the fellowship," Lila had said without preamble. Ethan had felt his stomach drop. "What? Why?" "Because I don't want it," Lila had said firmly. "I thought about it for weeks. I went to the interview, I met the team, I saw what the program offered. It's everything my father wanted for me, and I realized that's exactly the problem. I'd be going for him, not for me. I'd be running away from the life I actually want because everyone keeps telling me it's the wrong choice." "Lila, you can't turn down an opportunity like that because of me." "I'm not," Lila had interrupted. "I'm turning it down because I don't want to specialize in maternal fetal medicine. I like what I do here. I like my patients. I like delivering babies and being there for women during one of the most important moments of their lives. Hopkins would mean research and high-risk cases and politics, and that's not why I became a doctor." "But your father—" "My father wants a lot of things," Lila had said. "He wanted me to marry Adrian. He wanted me to follow his career path. He wanted me to make decisions based on prestige and status instead of what actually makes me happy. And I'm done living his life instead of mine." Ethan had stared at her, wanting desperately to believe her, but afraid to hope. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure about what I don't want," Lila had said. "But I need to know what you want, Ethan, because I can't do this if you're going to run away every time things get hard. I need to know if you're actually in this with me or if you're just waiting for the next excuse to push me away." The words had hit him like a punch to the gut because they were true. He had pushed her away. He'd used her career and her father's disapproval as excuses to protect himself from the possibility of being hurt again. "I'm scared," Ethan had admitted, the words coming out raw and honest. "I'm terrified, actually. Jennifer left because I wasn't enough, and some part of me is convinced you'll realize the same thing eventually. That I'm just a divorced single dad with a modest job and a kid who comes with baggage, and you deserve so much more than that." "That's not your decision to make," Lila had said, stepping closer. "You don't get to decide what I deserve. I do. And what I want, what I've wanted since the night you opened your door to a stranger who knocked by mistake, is you. You and Maya, and this messy, complicated, beautiful life we've been building together. Even if it costs you your relationship with your father?" "Even then," Lila had said without hesitation, "my father loves me, but he doesn't see me. He sees the daughter he planned for, the career he orchestrated, the future he mapped out before I ever had a say. But you see me, the real me, not the doctor or the daughter or whatever role everyone else needs me to play. And Maya sees me the same way. When I'm with you two, I'm just Lila. That's worth more than any fellowship." Ethan had felt something break open in his chest, all the fear and doubt he'd been carrying since the divorce, maybe even longer. "I love you," he'd said. "I've loved you since that Saturday at the farmer's market when Maya held both our hands, and I realized I wanted that forever. And I'm sorry I let my fear hurt you. I'm sorry I pushed you away instead of fighting for us." "Then fight now," Lila had said, and there were tears on her cheeks. "Fight with me. Not against your fear or my father or everyone's expectations, but with me, as a team, like you promised that night at the benefit." Ethan had closed the distance between them and kissed her, pouring every apology and promise and hope into it. When they'd pulled apart, both breathing hard, he'd rested his forehead against hers. "I'm all in," he'd said. "No more running. No more pushing you away. Whatever comes next, we face it together." "Together," Lila had agreed and kissed him again. They'd still been standing there, wrapped in each other, when the sound of a key in the lock had made them both turn. Maya had burst through the door with her usual energy, then stopped dead when she'd seen Lila. "Lila!" she'd shrieked, dropping her backpack and running across the room to throw herself at Lila's legs. "You're here! I missed you so much!" "I missed you too, sweetheart," Lila had said, kneeling down to Maya's level and pulling her into a proper hug. "I'm sorry I've been away." "Daddy said you had important work stuff," Maya had said, pulling back to look at Lila seriously. "But you're not leaving, right? You're staying?" "I'm staying," Lila had confirmed, glancing up at Ethan. "If that's okay with you." "It's more than okay," Maya had said solemnly. "Because we're a family, right, Daddy?" Ethan had looked at his daughter and the woman he loved, both watching him with hope in their eyes, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. "Right," he'd agreed. "We're a family." The next few weeks had been about rebuilding, about proving through actions that their commitment was real. Lila had started keeping more of her things at Ethan's house until the line between her place and his place had blurred into simply home. Maya had blossomed with Lila's consistent presence, her nightmares becoming less frequent, her smile coming more easily. But the issue of Dr. Bennett still loomed large. Lila hadn't spoken to her father since turning down the fellowship, and the silence between them had stretched from days into weeks. Ethan had suggested she reach out, try to mend bridges, but Lila had been firm. "He needs to accept this on his own terms," she'd said. "I'm not going to beg for his approval anymore. When he's ready to have a relationship with me as I actually am, not as he wants me to be, I'll be here." The breaking point had come in March, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Ethan's phone had rung with an unknown number. "Mr. Cole?" The voice had been professional, female, unfamiliar. "This is Margaret Chen from Charleston Memorial Hospital. I'm the chief of staff. Do you have a moment?" Ethan's first thought had been that something had happened to Lila, and his heart had kicked into overdrive. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Dr. Chen had assured him. "But I'd like to meet with you if possible. There's a matter concerning Dr. Bennett, Dr. Lila Bennett, that I think would benefit from your input." They'd arranged to meet the following morning at a coffee shop near the hospital. Ethan had arrived 15 minutes early, nervous and confused about what the chief of staff could possibly want from him. Dr. Chen had been a slight Asian woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an air of authority that reminded him of his favorite college professor. "Thank you for meeting me," she'd said, shaking his hand. "I know this is unusual, but I thought it was important we talk." "About Lila?" Ethan had prompted. "About Lila and about her father and about a situation that's become increasingly untenable at the hospital." Dr. Chen had folded her hands on the table. "I'm going to be frank with you, Mr. Cole. Dr. Richard Bennett is one of our most respected surgeons. He's also become a problem." Ethan had stayed quiet, letting her continue. "Since Dr. Lila Bennett turned down the Hopkins Fellowship, her father has been making things difficult for her at the hospital. Nothing overtly actionable, but a pattern of behavior that's affecting her ability to do her job. He's undermined her in front of colleagues, excluded her from important meetings, and made it clear he disapproves of her personal choices. We've had complaints from other staff members who feel uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out in our workplace." "I'm sorry," Ethan had said. "I never wanted to cause problems for her." "You didn't cause them," Dr. Chen had said firmly. "Dr. Richard Bennett did. And here's the thing. Lila is an exceptional physician. Her patient satisfaction scores are among the highest in our obstetrics department. She's compassionate, skilled, and exactly the kind of doctor we want representing Charleston Memorial. I don't want to lose her because her father can't separate his personal disappointments from his professional behavior." "What can I do?" Ethan had asked. "Help me understand the situation from your perspective," Dr. Chen had said. "Because Dr. Richard Bennett came to my office last week and suggested that his daughter is making poor decisions due to personal distractions. He implied that her judgment is compromised. I need to know if there's any truth to that before I address this formally." Ethan had taken a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Lila turned down Hopkins because she doesn't want to specialize in maternal fetal medicine. She loves what she does here. As for her judgment being compromised, I've never seen her be anything less than completely professional. Her personal life and her work life are separate. The only person struggling with that distinction is her father." Dr. Chen had nodded slowly. That aligns with what I've observed. And the two of you are in a serious relationship? Yes, Ethan had said without hesitation. We're planning a future together. Including her stepdaughter? My daughter Maya, Ethan had confirmed, and yes, they're very close. Dr. Bennett has painted you as an opportunist, Dr. Chen had said bluntly. Someone taking advantage of his daughter's kind nature. I can understand why he'd see it that way, Ethan had admitted. From the outside, it probably looks like I have everything to gain. But the truth is, I love his daughter. I'm building a life with her because I can't imagine my life without her. And I'd do anything to support her career, including stepping aside if that's what was best for her. But it's not what's best for her. She knows what she wants, and it's not the life her father planned. Dr. Chen had studied him for a long moment. Thank you for your honesty, she'd said finally. I'm going to have a conversation with Dr. Richard Bennett about appropriate workplace behavior. What he does with his personal relationship with his daughter is his business, but I won't allow family drama to affect patient care or staff morale. The conversation had ended shortly after, and Ethan had driven to work feeling like something significant had shifted, though he wasn't sure what. The answer had come 2 days later when Lila had shown up at his house after her shift, her expression a mixture of shock and relief. My father asked to meet me for coffee tomorrow, she'd said. He actually said please in the text. He never says please. Are you going to go? Ethan had asked. Yeah, Lila had decided. I need to hear what he has to say, but you should know, Dr. Chen called him into her office yesterday. She told him that if he continues creating a hostile work environment for me, there will be professional consequences. The hospital board is watching him. I met with Dr. Chen earlier this week, Ethan had admitted. She wanted my perspective on the situation. Lila had looked stunned. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to get your hopes up in case nothing came of it, but she seemed genuinely concerned about you and about making sure the hospital remains a good place for you to work. What did you tell her? The truth, Ethan had said, that you're an exceptional doctor, that you know what you want, and that the only person with a problem is your father. Lila had kissed him then, soft and grateful. Thank you for having my back. Always, Ethan had promised. The next day, Lila had met her father at the same coffee shop where Ethan had met with Dr. Chen. She'd told Ethan about it that evening while they made dinner together, Maya playing in the living room. He apologized, Lila had said, still sounding slightly dazed. My father actually apologized. He said he'd been wrong to pressure me about Hopkins, wrong to interfere with my career, and wrong to judge my relationship with you without getting to know you. What changed his mind? Ethan had asked, though he suspected he knew. Dr. Chen's conversation was part of it, Lila had admitted. Apparently she was very clear that his behavior was unacceptable. But he also said he'd been doing some thinking, that he'd watched me over the past few months and realized I was happy. Really happy, in a way he hadn't seen in years, and he said that maybe that mattered more than his plans for my life. That's a big admission for him, Ethan had observed. It is, Lila had agreed. He's still not thrilled about us. He was very clear about that. But he said he wants to try. He wants to get to know you properly, and he wants to be part of my life even if it's not the life he envisioned. How do you feel about that? Relieved, Lila had said, cautiously hopeful. He's my father, and despite everything, I love him. I want him in my life, but I also made it clear that you and Maya are my family now. That's not negotiable. What did he say? He said he understood, Lila had replied. And then he asked if you'd be willing to have dinner with him. Just the two of you. He wants to talk. Ethan's stomach had clenched. When? Saturday night, if you're available. I told him I'd ask you, but that you'd probably agree because you're a better person than he deserves. So on Saturday evening, Ethan had found himself sitting across from Dr. Richard Bennett at an upscale steakhouse, both of them navigating the awkward territory of building a relationship from scratch. Thank you for coming, Bennett had said after they'd ordered. I know this is uncomfortable. A little, Ethan had admitted. I owe you an apology, Bennett had continued. I came to your house and said some cruel things. I questioned your character and your motives without knowing anything about you, except that you weren't what I'd planned for my daughter. You were protecting her, Ethan had said. I understand that. Yes, but I was wrong about what she needed protecting from, Bennett had said. I thought you were a threat to her future. I didn't realize you were part of it. They'd talked for 2 hours about Ethan's work, his divorce, his approach to parenting Maya, his intentions with Lila. Bennett had asked hard questions, but fairly, and Ethan had answered honestly. By the end of the evening, they hadn't become friends, but they'd reached something like mutual respect. "I'm not going to pretend I'm completely comfortable with this," Bennett had said as they'd parted ways. "You're not what I imagined for Lila, but she's made her choice, and I can either accept it and be part of her life, or hold on to my pride and lose my daughter. I choose her." "That's all I'm asking," Ethan had said. "A chance to prove I'm worthy of her." "You don't need to prove that to me," Bennett had said. "You need to prove it to her every day, and from what I've observed, you're already doing that." Spring had arrived with warmth and new beginnings. Lila had started spending most nights at Ethan's house, and they'd begun talking seriously about her moving in permanently. Maya had been thrilled at the prospect, helping Lila pack her things and designating which drawer would be hers in Ethan's dresser. Life had settled into a new normal, morning routines that included all three of them, weekends at the park or the beach, quiet evenings after Maya went to bed where Ethan and Lila planned their future together. Doctor. Bennett had started joining them for occasional Sunday dinners, his relationship with Lila slowly mending as he made genuine efforts to accept her choices. Then, on a warm evening in late April, Lila had come home from her shift looking pale and shaken. Ethan had been helping Maya with a school project at the kitchen table when Lila had walked in, and he'd immediately known something was wrong. "Can we talk?" Lila had asked quietly. "Alone?" Ethan had settled Maya in front of the TV and joined Lila in the bedroom, his heart pounding with a familiar fear. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Lila had said quickly. "I just need to tell you something, and I don't know how you're going to react." "Whatever it is, we'll deal with it," Ethan had promised. Lila had taken a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The words had hung in the air between them, and Ethan had felt the world tilt slightly. "You're what?" "Pregnant," Lila had repeated, her voice shaking. "About 8 weeks along. I started feeling off a couple of weeks ago, but I thought it was stress. Then today, I was examining a patient who mentioned similar symptoms, and I realized I hadn't had a period since February. So I took a test at the hospital, and positive." Ethan had sat down on the edge of the bed, processing. A baby. They were having a baby. He and Lila were going to be parents together. "Ethan, please say something," Lila had said, and he'd heard the fear in her voice. "I know this is fast. I know we're still figuring things out, but I need to know what you're thinking." He'd looked up at her, this incredible woman who'd knocked on his door by mistake and changed everything, and felt something settle into place. "I'm thinking that Maya's going to be an amazing big sister," he'd said. "I'm thinking that we're going to need a bigger house. I'm thinking that I love you, and I can't wait to do this with you." Lila had burst into tears, and Ethan had pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried out relief and fear and joy, all mixed together. "You're not scared?" she'd asked against his chest. "I'm terrified," Ethan had admitted, "but in a good way, this is real and it's happening and it's what I want kind of way." They'd told Maya the next morning over breakfast. She'd been confused at first about what baby meant in practical terms. But when Ethan had explained that Lila was growing a baby brother or sister in her belly and she'd get to help take care of it, Maya's face had lit up like Christmas morning. "Can I name it?" she'd asked immediately. "We'll all pick the name together," Lila had promised. "Can I tell everyone at school?" "Maybe wait until we tell the grandparents first," Ethan had suggested. They'd told Dr. Bennett the following Sunday over dinner. He'd been quiet for a long moment after Lila had shared the news, and Ethan had braced himself for criticism or disappointment. Instead, Bennett's eyes had filled with tears. "A grandchild," he'd said quietly. "I'm going to be a grandfather." "Are you okay with this?" Lila had asked uncertainly. "Am I okay with my daughter starting a family with a man who loves her and is committed to building a life with her?" "Yes, Lila, I'm okay with this. I'm more than okay." He turned to Ethan. "I assume there will be a wedding before the baby arrives?" "That's the plan," Ethan had confirmed, glancing at Lila. They'd talked about it in general terms but hadn't made any concrete decisions yet. "Actually," Ethan had said, making a decision in the moment, "there's something I want to do first." He'd left the table and gone to his bedroom, where he'd retrieved the small velvet box he'd been carrying in his pocket for the past 3 weeks. He'd bought the ring the week after they'd gotten back together, knowing with absolute certainty that he wanted to marry Lila, wanted to build a life and a family with her, wanted to wake up beside her for the rest of his life. When he'd returned to the dining room, Lila had looked confused until he'd dropped to one knee beside her chair. Her hand had flown to her mouth, and Maya had squealed with excitement. "Lila Bennett," Ethan had said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You knocked on my door by mistake 8 months ago, and it was the best mistake that ever happened to me. You've loved me and Maya when we needed it most. You've fought for us against every pressure and expectation. You've made us a family. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Lila had said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." He'd slipped the ring onto her finger, and Maya had launched herself at both of them, creating a 3-person hug that had felt like every good thing Ethan had ever hoped for, even Doctor. Bennett had been smiling, his eyes wet as he'd watched his daughter say yes to a future he hadn't planned but could finally accept. They'd married in early June, before Lila started showing too much. It had been a small ceremony in the garden of a historic Charleston venue, just close family and friends, nothing fancy or ostentatious. Maya had been the flower girl, taking her job seriously as she'd scattered petals down the aisle. Lila had worn a simple cream-colored dress that showed the slight curve of her belly, and Ethan had worn the same tux from the hospital benefit, the one he'd worn the night everything had shifted between them. Doctor Bennett had walked Lila down the aisle, and when he'd placed her hand in Ethan's, he'd leaned in and whispered something that made Lila smile through her tears. Later she'd told Ethan what her father had said. "Be happy. That's all I ever really wanted for you." The ceremony had been simple and heartfelt. They'd written their own vows, and when it had been Ethan's turn to speak, he'd looked at Lila and Maya standing beside him and felt the weight of how far they'd come. "8 months ago, I was alone," he'd said. "I was scared and tired and convinced that the best parts of my life were behind me. Then you knocked on my door looking for someone who didn't live there anymore. And you found me instead. You found us. And you chose us every single day, even when it was hard, even when it would have been easier to walk away. You fought for this family when I was too scared to believe it could be real. So I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of that faith. I'll choose you every day and every way for as long as we both live." There hadn't been a dry eye in the garden. They'd honeymooned for a long weekend at a beach house in Folly Beach, just the 3 of them, building sandcastles and collecting shells and eating ice cream for dinner because they were on vacation and nobody could tell them otherwise. Maya had fallen asleep between them on the last night, and Ethan and Lila had lain on either side of her, hands clasped over their daughter's sleeping form, planning the future. "I want at least 3 kids, Lila had whispered. "3 seems like a lot," Ethan had teased. "Can we start with the 2 we'll have and see how it goes?" "Deal," Lila had agreed, "but I'm calling it now. We're getting at least 1 more after this one." Summer had passed in a blur of preparations and doctor's appointments and watching Lila's belly grow. They'd bought a bigger house in August, a 4-bedroom colonial with a yard big enough for a swing set and a nursery that Maya had helped paint a soft yellow since they'd decided to be surprised by the baby's gender. Ethan's mother had come to visit and had fallen in love with Lila immediately, declaring that her new daughter-in-law was exactly what her son needed. Even Jennifer had reached out, a brief email congratulating him on his marriage and asking if she could send Maya a birthday present. Ethan had discussed it with Lila and Maya, and they'd agreed that maintaining a minimal relationship was okay as long as it didn't hurt Maya. His daughter had received a card and a gift certificate on her 6th birthday, and she'd accepted it with the same equanimity she approached most things these days. "My birth mom," she'd explained to her friends at her birthday party, "doesn't live with us. But my mom Lila does, and she's having a baby, so I'm going to be a big sister." The certainty in her voice had made Ethan's chest tight with gratitude for this small human who'd adapted to so much change with such grace. The baby had arrived on a crisp October morning, 2 weeks before the due date. Lila's water had broken at 5 a.m., and by noon, Ethan had been holding his newborn daughter while Maya peered at her with wide, wondering eyes. "She's so small," Maya had whispered. "Can I touch her?" "Gently," Lila had said from the hospital bed, exhausted but glowing. Maya had stroked the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and when the baby's fingers had wrapped around Maya's, his older daughter's face had transformed with pure joy. "She likes me," Maya had declared. "She loves you," Ethan had corrected. "You're her big sister." They'd named her Sophie Grace Cole. Sophie because Lila had always loved the name, and Grace because she'd been exactly that, a Grace none of them had expected but all of them needed. Dr. Bennett had arrived at the hospital an hour later with flowers and tears in his eyes, as he'd held his granddaughter for the first time. "She has your nose," he'd told Lila. "She has Ethan's eyes," Lila had countered. "She's perfect," Bennett had said. And for once, there had been no conditions or expectations in his voice, just pure love for his family. The first few weeks with the newborn had been chaotic in ways Ethan had forgotten and Lila was experiencing for the first time. But they'd navigated it together, late-night feedings and diaper changes, and trying to remember if they'd eaten lunch while Maya had adjusted to being a big sister with remarkable patience. Marcus and Sarah had come to visit, bringing a casserole and their own 3 kids who'd immediately wanted to hold the baby. "You did good, man," Marcus had said, watching Ethan rock Sophie, while Lila helped Maya show the other kids her new toys. "You really did." "We got lucky," Ethan had said. "Nah," Marcus had disagreed. "Luck is finding a $20 bill in your jacket. This is something else. This is building something real." By Thanksgiving, they'd settled into a new rhythm. Sophie was sleeping in longer stretches. Maya had fully embraced her role as big sister, and Lila had started talking about going back to work part-time in January. They'd hosted Thanksgiving dinner at their new house. Ethan's mother, Dr. Bennett, some of Lila's cousins who'd made the effort to get to know them, and Marcus's entire family because the dining room table was big enough, and why not? Ethan had stood in his kitchen that afternoon, surrounded by the chaos of too many people and too much food and children running in circles, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just happiness or contentment, but peace. The bone-deep certainty that this was where he was meant to be, that all the pain and fear and mistakes had led him exactly here. Lila had found him there, slipping her arms around his waist from behind and resting her cheek against his back. "You okay?" she'd asked. "Better than okay," Ethan had said, turning to face her. Through the doorway, he could see Maya helping Sophie practice sitting up, while Dr. Bennett supervised with the careful attention of a devoted grandfather. "I was just thinking about how far we've come, how different my life is from a year ago." "Better different or worse different?" Lila had teased. "The best different," Ethan had said, kissing her forehead. "A year ago, I was alone and scared and convinced I'd already had my shot at happiness. Now I have you and Maya and Sophie and a house full of family. I have everything I didn't know I was missing." "We both do," Lila had said. "I spent so long trying to be what everyone else wanted me to be. And then you opened your door and saw me, really saw me, and everything changed." "Best wrong door I ever knocked on," Lila had said, and they'd both laughed at the memory of that September night when a simple mistake had become the beginning of everything. That evening, after everyone had gone home and the kids were asleep, Ethan and Lila had sat on their back porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars and talking about the future. They'd discussed Maya's upcoming school play and Sophie's first Christmas and whether they should get a dog like Maya had been requesting. "Can you believe it's only been a year?" Lila had said. "1 year since I knocked on your door." "Feels like a lifetime," Ethan had agreed. "In the best way." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd realized my mistake before you answered?" Lila had asked. "If I'd checked the address and gone to the right house instead?" "All the time," Ethan had admitted. "But I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad you knocked on my door. I'm glad you stayed for coffee. I'm glad you fought for us when I was too scared to fight for myself." "I'd do it all again," Lila had said. "Every difficult conversation with my father, every awkward hospital gala, every moment of doubt. Because this, us, our family, this life we've built, this is worth everything." Inside, Sophie had started fussing through the baby monitor, and they'd both stood to go check on her. But Ethan had paused at the door, looking back at the street beyond their yard, at the house they'd left behind across the way where this had all started. "What are you thinking?" Lila had asked. "I'm thinking about the night you knocked," Ethan had said. "I almost didn't answer. I was tired and it was late and I just wanted to be alone. But something made me open that door, and my whole life changed." "Mine too," Lila had said, taking his hand. Best mistake either of us ever made. They'd gone inside together to check on their daughter. To this life they'd built from a simple knock on the wrong door, and Ethan had known with absolute certainty that he'd spend the rest of his life being grateful for that September evening when Lila Bennett had shown up on his porch looking for someone who didn't live there anymore, and found exactly what she needed instead. Years later, when people asked them how they'd met, Lila would always smile and say she'd knocked on the wrong door. And Ethan would add that it was the right door after all, just at the right time, with the right person on the other side. What had begun as a mistake had become their greatest fortune, a family built not on perfection or planning, but on courage, love, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. On Prescott Street, in a house that had once felt too big and empty, laughter now echoed through the rooms. A small family who'd found each other against all odds had built something that would last. And it had all started with 3 simple knocks on a quiet Tuesday evening, when 2 tired people had recognized the same exhaustion in each other's eyes and decided, without knowing it yet, to stop being alone.